Chapter 1. I can't believe how hot it is, Faith groaned to the other girls as they walked toward the matchmaking dance they'd traveled over 1,000 miles by train to attend. Can you believe we're really here? Whispered Erna, Faith's twin, her fingers tight on Faith's arm. Let's just enjoy it, Faith replied, smoothing down her hand-sewn dress with practiced hands. Her green eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and nerves. She'd never been the most outspoken of the 9 sisters who had been raised in a foundling home in Massachusetts. She was the softest-spoken of the bunch, often deferring to her twin to speak for them both. They joined the stream of people heading toward the porch, the wooden boards creaking a welcome underfoot. This dance gave them all a chance at independence. A chance to truly start their lives, and Faith wasn't sure if she wanted marriage, but she knew this was where she needed to be. Beside her sisters. As they stepped into the church where the dance was held, and their hearts were meant to join with others, Faith stopped short at the sight of a man with dark hair, brown eyes, and a short, well-groomed beard. He wore a suit that made him look like he should be a banker in Boston and not a rancher near Fort Worth as they'd been told most of the men would be. If not for the Stetson atop his head, she would have assumed he was a banker, or a man who worked on Wall Street in New York City. Not that she'd ever met any man who fit either description, but she had a mental image of what they would be like. Who's that? One of the girls beside Faith whispered, craning her neck for a better look. I'm not sure. But I want to meet him, Faith said softly, more to herself than anyone else. She couldn't help but admire how effortlessly he greeted the others at the dance, each handshake and clap on the back seeming as genuine as the last. Seems like everybody knows him, Erna muttered, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Apparently so, Faith agreed, noting the way the room seemed to brighten just a touch more at his presence. Faith's gaze wandered over the sea of Stetsons and gingham, the warm air humming with fiddle music and laughter. She was stitching together her impressions of the dance when her eyes landed on him again. A jolt, quick and unexpected, raced through her heart as the man's gaze met hers. Evening, miss, Kane said, his voice smooth as he approached her through the crowd, a path parting for him as if by some unspoken agreement. Good evening, Faith replied, warmth coloring her cheeks. Her voice was soft, and the music was loud, and the man leaned down to hear her words better. I'm Kane Edwards, he said softly. Are you one of the orphans we were told would be here? Faith nodded. I'm Faith Brown. It's nice to meet you, Faith. Would you do me the honor of dancing with me? Faith felt herself blush again, but she nodded once. Certainly. As he led her onto the dance floor, her heart leapt into her chest. His mere touch felt like it was sending fire through her. How had he done that? She hadn't thought that she could be any hotter than she was standing there in the crowded church on a hot summer night. Their steps fell into a rhythm as the music wrapped around them, guiding their movements. Faith couldn't help but steal glances at Kane's handsome profile, the way his eyes crinkled with humor as he talked about his ranch and the horses he tended to. His words were like a gentle breeze that stirred something in Faith's heart, a yearning for more than just duty and responsibility. She found herself laughing at his stories, her green eyes lit with a newfound sense of freedom and joy. As the dance came to an end, Kane escorted Faith back to her sisters, a smile playing on his lips. The other girls watched with eager eyes, whispering among themselves as Faith tried to compose herself. Erna nudged her sister discreetly, a knowing glint in her eye. It seems you've made quite an impression on that gentleman, Erna teased in a hushed tone. Faith felt her cheeks warm once more, but she couldn't deny the flutter of excitement that bubbled in her chest. Kane turned to face her, his gaze warm and inviting. Miss Faith, would you care to take a walk with me tomorrow? I'd love the chance to get to know you better, Kane asked, his voice earnest. Faith's heart skipped a beat at the prospect of spending more time with the charming rancher. She glanced at Erna, who offered an encouraging smile, silently urging her to accept. With a shy yet radiant smile, Faith nodded. I would like that very much, Mr. Edwards. Kane's grin widened, and he tipped his Stetson in a gallant gesture. It's settled then. Tomorrow afternoon by the creek behind Mrs. Daly's house? That's where I heard you were all staying. Faith nodded again, feeling a rush of anticipation at the thought of their upcoming meeting. As Kane excused himself to greet other guests, Faith couldn't help but feel a newfound sense of hope stir within her. Maybe this matchmaking dance held the promise of something more than she'd thought. They danced on and off throughout the evening, and as Faith watched, her sisters all paired off, most of them marrying that very night. At the end of the evening, she found herself standing beside Mrs. Jackson and Elizabeth Tandy, the woman who had raised her and the woman who had set up this dance, respectively. "Did you find none of the men to your liking?" Mrs. Jackson asked, obviously worried about Faith. "I'm going on a walk with one of them tomorrow. The others, well, they're bolder than me, being willing to marry as soon as they met. But I don't think I could do that, and thankfully, Kane Edwards didn't ask me to." "Kane Edwards?" Elizabeth asked. "I'll ask my sister Susan about him when we get back to her house. I'm sure she'll know everything about the man. I think," Faith hesitated for a moment. "I think he's someone I could love someday." As the three of them walked back toward the house, Faith realized she was the last sister standing. All of the others had married and gone home with their new husbands. It was just her. She had never spent a night without her twin sister at her side, and she felt a pang as she realized her life was about to change drastically. Oh, how she would miss Erna. The following afternoon, Faith took extra care with her appearance, thankful for Elizabeth's kindness as she loaned Faith the prettiest dress she'd ever worn. "I'm nervous," she admitted as the older woman fixed her hair. "I understand," Elizabeth said kindly. "But Susan says Kane is a wonderful man who owns the biggest ranch this side of Fort Worth." Faith wrinkled her nose. "I think I'd find a man who had no money to his name more appealing," she said softly. "I have never felt comfortable around people of wealth. Not that I've had many occasions to be around someone like that." Elizabeth smiled, her hands deftly pinning a loose strand of Faith's vibrant red hair. "Faith, my dear, it's true that wealth can be intimidating, but don't let it cloud your judgment. Kane Edwards may have riches, but from what I've observed, his heart is as genuine as they come. Sometimes, it's not about the money but the character of the man that truly matters." Faith met Elizabeth's reassuring gaze, finding solace in her words. The older woman's guidance was like a beacon in the uncertainty that swirled within her. "But how do I act around him? What if everything I say or do is wrong?" Faith's worry crept into her voice, revealing her insecurities. Elizabeth chuckled softly, her demeanor maternal and understanding. "My dear Faith, just be yourself. A man worth his salt will appreciate your authenticity over any pretense. Show interest in him, ask questions about his life and work on the ranch, and most importantly, listen to his answers with genuine curiosity. Let him see the kindness and warmth that radiate from your heart, and let your inner beauty shine brighter than any diamonds he may possess." As they reached the meeting spot behind Mrs. Daly's house, Faith took in a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She turned to Elizabeth and Mrs. Jackson, who were walking a few steps behind them as promised. "Now, Faith," Elizabeth whispered with a smile that conveyed both encouragement and wisdom, "remember to look him in the eye when you speak, stand tall but relaxed, and let your natural grace guide you. We'll be close by but out of earshot, so you can enjoy your time together without feeling pressured." Faith nodded gratefully, her heart filled with gratitude for the support of these two remarkable women who had been like family to her. As she turned back to face Kane, waiting by the bubbling creek with a warm smile on his face, she felt a newfound sense of determination. Elizabeth's words echoed in her mind, reminding her to be true to herself and to approach this meeting with an open heart. Kane Edwards stood there, the sunlight casting a golden halo around him, making him appear almost ethereal against the backdrop of the idyllic scenery. With a deep breath, Faith stepped forward, her emerald eyes locking with his warm brown gaze. "Mr. Edwards," she greeted him softly, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Thank you for meeting me here." Kane's eyes lit up at the sight of Faith, his expression softening as he took in her beauty and grace. "Faith, it's my pleasure," he replied warmly, extending his hand toward her. "Please, call me Kane." Chapter 2. Faith's cheeks warmed as she took the arm Kane offered, pleased that he had good manners. For the first time with a man, she didn't feel the need to shy away from his gaze. Instead, she found comfort there, in those kind eyes that seemed genuinely interested in what lay beyond her green ones. His presence eased the fluttering in her stomach. Shall we walk? Kane gestured to the path that wound through the Daly's ranch, lined with trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the breeze. Please, Faith said, and together they stepped onto the path, their two chaperones trailing behind, leaving them to discover the beginnings of something new. With the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, Faith and Kane strolled side by side along the creek's meandering path. Birds chirped merrily in the background, their melodies a sweet soundtrack to the budding conversation. Tell me about your childhood, Kane said, casting her a glance that was both curious and encouraging. Faith swallowed hard, wondering exactly what she should tell him. Well, it was quite different from yours, I'm sure. I grew up in an orphanage with my twin sister, Erna. We were inseparable, two peas in a pod. Thankfully, we're not identical, or I wouldn't be sure I was really me half the time. Two peas, huh? Kane's lips quirked up with amusement. Did you get into mischief together? We got into our fair share, she admitted, her eyes glinting with the memory. But we always looked out for each other. Erna has a gift with baking, and I found comfort in sewing. It brought us closer, having those little bits of happiness to share. Sounds like you made the best of it, he remarked, his voice carrying a note of admiration. We did, Faith confirmed. We dreamt of a future where we could use our talents beyond the orphanage walls, a place where we could belong and put down roots. A simple life but our own. Simple is good, Kane nodded. There's beauty in simplicity, don't you think? Absolutely, she agreed, feeling her heart swell with hope at the shared sentiment. That's what we've always wanted. Kane tilted his head, a lock of brown hair falling into his eyes as he listened to Faith. He brushed it aside with a practiced hand, his smile never wavering as she spoke. His gaze remained fixed on her, the occasional nod signaling his understanding of her past. The way her green eyes lit up when she mentioned Erna and their shared dreams told him more than words ever could. Your bond with Erna sounds remarkable, Kane said earnestly. Having someone to share your dreams with is a rare treasure. Faith's cheeks flushed with a soft pink hue, touched by his attentiveness. She nodded, a wistful grin tugging at her lips. It is. And what about you? What was it like growing up on your family's ranch? Ah, the ranch, Kane began, his voice carrying a hint of nostalgia. It was an endless adventure for a boy. Miles of open land where my imagination ran as wild as the horses. He gestured broadly, as if painting the vastness of the Texan landscape with his hands. There's a freedom out there that's hard to put into words, a sense of being part of something bigger. Sounds wonderful, Faith murmured, imagining a young Kane galloping across the fields, the wind in his hair. It was, he agreed. But with all that space comes responsibility. The ranch has been in my family for generations, and now it's on my shoulders. It's not just land, it's a legacy I need to uphold. His charismatic presence seemed to grow even warmer with the weight of this confession. Must be quite the burden at times, she said softly, empathy clear in her expression. Sometimes, he admitted, his closely trimmed beard shadowing his thoughtful frown. But it's also an honor. My parents left it in my care, and I intend to make them proud. Where are your parents now? She asked. Mrs. Jackson was the only mother she'd ever known, and she'd had to share her with a multitude of other orphans. They've both passed. I miss them every day. So that's something else we have in common. We're both orphans. I suppose we are, Kane said. Their steps slowed as they reached the end of the path, the gazebo coming back into view. They paused, their connection deepened by the exchange of personal histories and quiet confidences. Thank you for sharing that with me, Kane, Faith said. Her heart felt lighter, her thoughts already dancing around the idea of seeing him again. Thank you for listening, he replied, his smile returning. It's not every day you meet someone who understands the value of dreams and responsibilities. Nor is it every day you find someone willing to share them, Faith added, her own smile reflecting his. Faith brushed a stray curl from her forehead, the red strands like flames against her pale skin, as they ambled along the garden path. The scent of wildflowers mingled with freshly cut grass, and birds chirped in the distant trees, a symphony of nature that both she and Kane seemed to appreciate. I loved coming here, Faith said, gesturing to the sprawling oaks that lined their walk. There's a simplicity in it that feels like home. Couldn't agree more, Kane replied, his gaze following the flight of a butterfly. Out on the ranch, there's a similar sense of peace. The land stretches out forever, and you can almost hear the earth's heartbeat beneath your feet. She smiled at the poetry in his words. I imagine sunrises are quite a sight from your porch. Best part of my day. Kane's eyes held a fondness for the memory. Speaking of beautiful things, Elizabeth mentioned you have quite the talent for sewing? Ah, yes. Faith laughed lightly, a blush coloring her cheeks. I do love to sew. There's something about transforming a plain piece of fabric into something more like a quilt, he ventured, recalling snippets of conversations overheard at the local market. Exactly. Quilts are a favorite of mine. Each one tells a story, don't you think? I think they do. My mother was a quilter as well. There are so many of her unfinished quilts in the attic at my house. His brown hair caught the sunlight as he nodded. Quilting is not unlike tending to cattle or crops. You start with something raw and shape it into something worthwhile. Is that what you love about ranching? She tilted her head, genuinely curious about the man beside her. Kane's smile was infectious. That, and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. There's a rhythm to it, a dance between man and land. It demands respect, but gives back tenfold. Respect and hard work, Faith echoed. Sounds like we value the same things, Kane. Seems we might, he agreed, his eyes meeting hers with a spark of kinship. Faith plucked a wildflower from the edge of the path, twirling its delicate petals in her fingers. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an amber glow over the park that seemed to ignite Kane's eyes with flecks of gold. Have you ever thought about the future? She asked. Kane paused, leaning against the wooden railing of a bridge that arched over the creek. I think of it often, he confessed, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. I dream of companionship, a partnership rooted in understanding and laughter. Laughter, Faith echoed, a soft smile tugging at her lips. That sounds like a beautiful dream. More than just laughter, Kane continued, his voice steady and sure. I want love, Faith. Not the kind arranged by convenience or status, but genuine love. A belonging that feels as natural as the land beneath my feet. Her heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment, she allowed herself to envision a future painted with the colors of love and acceptance. She turned to him, her reserve melting away. Sometimes I fear I'll never find that, she said, her green eyes reflecting vulnerability. I yearn for a place where I belong, where I'm cherished for more than just my ability to stitch a quilt or keep a tidy home. Faith, your worth is beyond measure, Kane assured her, his voice low and sincere. In your hands, thread and fabric become art. In your presence, order and beauty flourish. Anyone would be blessed to share a life with you. Even when I leave threads scattered like breadcrumbs across the floor? She asked, grinning up at him. Especially then, he chuckled, his brown hair ruffling in the gentle breeze. It means a life lived fully, embraced with passion. And isn't that what we're all searching for? Passion, she repeated. And purpose. Exactly. Kane reached for her hand, his touch light and reassuring. Together, those dreams don't seem so distant. Kane's gaze wandered across the land, taking in the golden hues of the setting sun as it dipped below the horizon. He seemed to wrestle with his thoughts before speaking again. Faith, I've always felt a bit adrift in the sea of expectations, he confessed, his usually confident voice carrying a rare tremor. The Edwards name comes with its own set of chains. Chains, she echoed, her hand still resting in his. Golden ones, but chains nonetheless. Kane's eyes met hers, earnest and unguarded. People see the ranch, the wealth, and they think they know me, but there's more to life than what money can buy. I dream of a love that's real, untainted by fortune or status. Real love, Faith mused, allowing herself to believe, if just for a moment, in the possibility of such a thing. Exactly. Love that sees beyond the surface, he said, squeezing her hand gently. I guess I fear never finding someone who looks at me and sees. Just Kane. Kane, she repeated, her heart resonating with his honesty. The name was no longer just a collection of letters, it was becoming a symbol of hope shared and dreams intertwined. They walked on, the path beneath their feet crunching softly as dusk enveloped the park. With each step, Faith felt the foundation of something solid forming between them, like the first stitches of a new pattern. "Thank you, Kane," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "For trusting me with your doubts." "Thank you, Faith," he replied, his thumb tracing circles over the back of her hand. "For making them feel less heavy." As they reached the spot where their walk had begun, an unspoken connection pulsed through the space between them. It was a feeling that spoke of kindred souls recognizing one another, a silent vow that here, in this small community outside Fort Worth, they could find the love and companionship they both craved. "Looks like we've come full circle," Faith remarked, her green eyes shining in the waning light. "Maybe it's a sign," Kane suggested, his smile hinting at hope for the future. "Maybe it is," she agreed, the corners of her mouth lifting in response. "Let's not let this be the last of our strolls," Kane said, his voice carrying a note of earnestness. The gazebo cast long shadows across their path, framing the moment with an almost ethereal quality. Faith's heart skipped a beat. "I would like that," she replied, her fingers dancing nervously along the hem of her dress. "The company has been more than pleasant. Next time, perhaps we could visit the river," he suggested, looking down at her with eyes that held the warmth of the setting sun. "It's peaceful there, and I reckon it would make for a fine quilting inspiration for you." Faith strolled back to the gazebo, her steps light on the gravel path. The lingering warmth from Kane's smile seemed to follow her, wrapping around her like a cherished quilt. Elizabeth and Mrs. Jackson were waiting, their curious gazes searching her face for any sign of how the meeting had gone. "Looks like you've caught some sun," Elizabeth teased, adjusting the ribbon in her own hair. "Or perhaps she's caught something far more interesting," Mrs. Jackson added with a knowing look. Faith's cheeks flushed, but she couldn't contain her happiness. "It went well," she admitted, her heart skipping a beat. "Tell us everything," Elizabeth exclaimed, linking her arm through Faith's as they started walking back toward the house. "Maybe not everything," Faith demurred with a grin, "but I will say this, I'm grateful. Grateful for the chance to meet someone like Kane." "Sounds promising," Elizabeth mused, her eyes twinkling. "More than that," Faith said, her mind replaying every moment of their conversation. "It's as if we've been traveling down separate paths only to find they're leading to the same place." "Love?" Elizabeth's voice was soft, almost reverent. "Perhaps," Faith whispered, allowing herself to indulge in the thought. "But even if it's not love yet, it's a connection. A real one. And that's more than I ever expected." "Life is full of surprises," Mrs. Jackson reminded them gently. "It really is," Faith agreed, her gaze lifting to the wide expanse of sky above, the colors of dusk painting it in shades of hope. "And I think this journey with Kane might be one of the best surprises yet." Chapter 3. The following day Faith walked beside Kane. "Tell me, Faith," Kane said, his voice teasing as he dodged a low-hanging branch, "did you ever climb trees as a girl, or were you too busy stitching quilts?" "Actually," Faith replied with a sparkle in her green eyes, "I was quite the climber. Erna and I would see who could reach the highest branch. But heavens forbid if we tore our dresses." Kane chuckled, picturing the little redhead scurrying up a tree. "And what would Mrs. Jackson say to that?" "Let's just say, she wasn't pleased," Faith said, her laugh light and carefree. "In the orphanage we all did chores based on our gender. We girls were expected to take care of the house, while the boys did the farm work. All except Gail, and I'll never understand how she managed to get away with building things while the rest of us cooked and cleaned." "Gail is one of your sisters who came here?" Faith nodded. "Mrs. Jackson named us in alphabetical order. Gail is the next orphan after me." She shook her head. "But she was allowed to build with the boys." "I'm not sure allowed is the right word, but she would sneak out and help the boys until Mrs. Jackson started to allow it. Not that it would have been any different if she hadn't allowed it." Gail wanted to be outside as much as I wanted to sit inside and quilt. They continued their stroll, sharing tales of mischievous escapades and simple joys from their youth. The heat of the summer day wrapped around them like a warm blanket, but the shade of the sprawling oak trees offered a respite as they meandered toward the creek. Arriving at the water's edge, the sound of the water was soothing. Faith didn't know what it was about water, but it made everything better. They stood side by side, watching the water dance over smooth stones. Kane turned to Faith, his brown hair catching the sunlight, and gently took her hand. "Faith," he began, "these moments with you, they are the brightest of my days." Her heart skipped a beat, and she found herself lost in the sincerity of his gaze. "Life has given me plenty, more than one man might deserve," Kane continued, his thumb caressing the back of her hand, "but without you, it feels as though it would all mean naught." Faith's breath caught in her throat. She saw not just the affluence he wore like a well-tailored coat, but the earnest man beneath, laying bare his soul before her. "Kane," she whispered, "you have become so dear to me. I'd be honored to stand by your side, through every season." Her simple acceptance, pure and unadorned, touched something deep within Kane. He grinned, a laugh escaping him, light as the breeze that rustled through the grasses. "Then let's not wait," he said. "Let's marry tomorrow, Faith. Unless you want a grand wedding?" Faith's laughter mingled with his. "Tomorrow," she decided. Faith and Kane hurried down the dusty road, their hands clasped tightly. The afternoon heat did little to dampen their spirits. "Bet Elizabeth and Mrs. Jackson never expected us to come back with this news," Kane said, laughing. "Nor did I," admitted Faith, her voice a light tremor, betraying the fluttering of her heart. They found Elizabeth and Mrs. Jackson along with Susan on the porch, fanning themselves in an attempt to combat the swelter of the summer day. "Faith, Kane, you both look like the cat that got the cream," Elizabeth greeted them with her usual warmth, her smile broadening as they approached. "Elizabeth, Mrs. Jackson," Kane said, his confident tone softened by the affection in his gaze as he looked at Faith, "we've decided to marry. And we wish to do so tomorrow." The announcement hung in the air for a brief moment, before breaking over the women like a wave. Mrs. Jackson sprang to her feet with unabashed delight. "Tomorrow?" exclaimed Mrs. Jackson. "Thank heavens I can see you married before I get back on that train and head back to Massachusetts. I was starting to think you weren't going to ever decide." Faith laughed. "We only met 2 days ago." "True, but your sisters all married right away." "It took us a little longer," Faith said, squeezing Kane's hand. "But when the heart knows, it knows." "Then you shall have our full support," Elizabeth declared, rising from her rocking chair. "Thank you," Kane said, his gratitude genuine. "We knew we could count on you both." "Let's see," mused Mrs. Jackson, "chairs, flowers, some ribbon to adorn the church." "Church?" Faith echoed, her brow knitting briefly. "Of course." Elizabeth chimed in. "The one where the dance was held. Where the two of you met." "I do want to keep it small." "Just the two of you along with us," Faith replied. "Then it's settled," Kane concluded, his arm wrapping around Faith's shoulders. "Tomorrow, we become man and wife." Elizabeth hugged Faith tightly. "We'll keep it small." Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a gentle glow on Faith as she stirred awake. A grin spread across her face as she remembered, today was the day she would marry Kane. With a flutter in her heart, she rose from bed and began to dress. Kane, too, was up with the dawn, his hand steady as he buttoned his shirt, his brown eyes shining with a mix of joy and nerves. He adjusted his collar in the mirror, then took a deep breath to center himself for the day ahead. "Today's the beginning, Faith," he whispered to his reflection, imagining his bride-to-be preparing herself just a short distance away. In her room, Faith slipped into the simple dress she'd chosen to be married in. "Looking beautiful, darling," Elizabeth's voice sang out as she entered the room, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you," Faith replied, her cheeks warming with a blush. "I'm so grateful for everything." "Darling, the pleasure is all ours," Mrs. Jackson chimed in from the doorway, her spectacles glinting in the morning light. "Now, let's get you married." The drive to the church was a blur of greenery and anticipation. Faith clutched the flowers, while Kane adjusted and readjusted his tie. When they arrived, the sight of the quaint church on the side of the country road made Faith's heart beat faster. What if she was doing the wrong thing? What a perfect place to be married, Elizabeth said, gesturing toward the small wooden structure. More than I imagined, Faith said, struggling to speak with the knot so tight in her stomach. Let's not dilly-dally now, Mrs. Jackson said with a soft chuckle. We've got a wedding to hold. While Elizabeth hurried to the parsonage to get the pastor, Faith, Kane, and Mrs. Jackson entered the church. They only waited for a minute before she was back with Amos in tow. Who gives this woman to be married to this man? Amos asked. I do, came Mrs. Jackson's tender affirmation from where she stood beside Faith. With a gentle squeeze of Faith's hand, she let go, entrusting her to Kane. Faith, Kane, Amos said softly, today you join your lives together. Not out of duty or necessity, but from a bond forged by genuine affection and mutual respect. Faith reached for Kane's hands, her fingertips trembling slightly against his steady grasp. He gave an encouraging squeeze, grounding her as she prepared to speak the words she had held close to her heart. The actual ceremony was so quick, Faith barely remembered it when it was over. But that was all right. She was married to the only man she'd ever truly been attracted to. By the power vested in me, Amos said, I pronounce you husband and wife. Kane, you may kiss your bride. Leaning in, Kane captured Faith's lips in a tender kiss that seemed to stop time itself. It was their first, and it felt fitting that it was happening there, where they'd met and danced their first dance. Congratulations! Elizabeth exclaimed, embracing them both. Your journey together starts with such love. It will surely endure the test of time. Thank you, Faith said, her green eyes sparkling with unshed tears of joy. For everything. Darling, this is only the beginning, Mrs. Jackson added, her voice thick with emotion. There's so much happiness ahead. Susan had stayed behind to cook a wedding supper, and though it was just a small group, it felt right. Look at all this. Faith exclaimed, admiring the food after they'd all gone back to the daily ranch. She could hardly believe how the community had come together on such short notice. Nothing too good for our Kane and his bride. Later, after they'd eaten supper, Faith looked at Kane. Today's been a dream, she whispered to him. Every day will be, with you by my side, Kane replied, his voice steady and sure. Seems like just yesterday we were strangers, Kane mused, leaning back against the tree's sturdy trunk. His voice was soft, meant only for her ears. Probably because we only met 3 days ago, Faith replied, her green eyes filled with amusement. She took a deep breath, the summer air heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and wildflowers. Who knew a simple stroll could lead to this, he chuckled, sweeping a loose strand of red hair from her face. You've turned my world upside down, Faith. She laughed, the sound mingling with the distant music. In the best way possible, I hope. Only the best, he affirmed, his gaze warm and steady. Can you believe it, Mrs. Edwards? Kane teased, his brown eyes glowing with mischief and mirth. Only if you can, Mr. Edwards, she shot back, her laughter mingling with the night air. Her red hair, crowned with wildflowers, danced with each chuckle. Never seen two people more suited for each other, Elizabeth said, handing them each a glass of sweet tea. Thank you, Elizabeth. We're blessed, Faith said, squeezing Kane's hand. Indeed we are, Kane agreed, lifting his glass. To our new life together. Faith smiled up at him. I'm glad that new life will be with you. Ready to conquer the world? Kane whispered, his arm wrapping around her waist. Always, she whispered back, her neat, practical nature giving way to dreams woven of love and shared tomorrows. Then let's start with tonight, he said. Chapter 4. Faith's heart fluttered as the carriage rolled over the gravel driveway, the sound crunching beneath the wheels like distant thunder. The house loomed ahead, grander than any she'd ever seen. Quite something, isn't it? Kane said, his voice rich with pride. Faith could only nod, her words caught in her throat like trapped butterflies. She felt very out of place as she looked at the house and the neat yard. Come on, he urged, offering her his hand as the carriage came to a stop. Let me show you around. The entryway swallowed them whole, marble floors cool and smooth underfoot, the chandelier above casting prisms of light that danced across the walls. Faith's eyes widened at the sight, every inch of space whispering wealth and luxury. Mrs. Hughes will keep things spick and span, Kane explained, motioning toward the sweeping staircase. And Cook will manage the meals. You needn't worry about those things. Faith frowned slightly, wringing her hands. Then what am I to do all day? Kane laughed, the sound warm and bright as sunlight through marmalade. Whatever your heart desires. Read, walk the gardens. Quilt, if you'd like. Make this home yours, Faith. In every way. Kane's hand was a gentle guide at the small of Faith's back, leading her through endless hallways adorned with paintings that seemed to watch with quiet anticipation. The air grew warmer, more intimate, as they approached a door set apart from the others by its ornate carvings and polished handle. Here, he murmured. The room beyond was bathed in the golden hues of sunset, spilling through lace curtains and painting the walls in soft amber. A large bed stood as the centerpiece, its covers turned down invitingly, and for a moment, Faith's breath caught in the delicate cage of her ribs. Are you all right? Kane's brown eyes searched hers, the concern in them genuine and disarming. She nodded. Yes, just nervous. It's all so new. His smile was a balm, soothing the flutter of nerves that danced beneath her skin. I'll be right here with you. With hands that told stories of strength and comfort, Kane eased the pins from Faith's hair, watching as the fiery strands tumbled free. Her heart hammered a staccato rhythm against her chest, each beat a step closer to a world unknown. Beautiful, he whispered, the word not just an observation but a vow. In the tender cocoon of the bedroom, time slowed. Each touch was a discovery, each kiss a revelation. Faith found her fears melting away like morning mist under the sun's gentle insistence. Kane, she said. Shoo, he soothed, his hands roaming over every inch of her skin with reverence. I've got you. And she believed him. Faith surrendered to the ebb and flow of sensation, the world outside the bedroom walls fading into insignificance. There was pain, a fleeting shadow chased away by Kane's patient care, and then, a connection profound and anchoring. In the silence that followed, punctuated only by the whisper of breath and the quiet shift of linen, Faith felt something within her unfurl, a sense of belonging. Was it? Kane began, his voice hesitant, laden with hope and concern. Perfect, Faith answered, her green eyes reflecting the depth of what they shared. Because it was with you. The sun wasn't fully risen when Faith's emerald eyes fluttered open, greeting her first day as Mrs. Kane Edwards. With the morning light spilling through the gauzy curtains and warming her face. Today marked the start of her new life as a wife. Faith slipped out of bed. The wooden floorboards felt cool under her feet as she quickly donned a simple cotton dress, its fabric whispering against her skin in the stillness of the room. She ran a brush through her fiery red hair, twisted it into a practical bun, and took a deep breath to steady the fluttering excitement in her chest. Descending the staircase with airy steps, Faith's ears perked up at the sound of clinking dishes and the aroma of sizzling bacon that guided her like an invisible hand toward the heart of her new home, the kitchen. Good morning, Mrs. Edwards, greeted the cook. My name is Esther Jenkins, but Kane just calls me Cook, said Mrs. Jenkins, a plump figure bustling around the stove with practiced ease. Her apron was speckled with flour, and her cheeks glowed from the heat of the kitchen. Please, call me Faith, she replied. How are you today? Ah, just fine, dearie, Mrs. Jenkins said, flashing a grin as warm as the oven's glow. And how's our new bride feeling on this fine morning? Excited. And a bit nervous, Faith admitted, clasping her hands together. I can't wait to learn all about ranch life. Then you've started in the right place. Mrs. Jenkins chuckled, nodding toward the stove. A hearty breakfast is the fuel for the day. Sit yourself down, and tell me how you like your eggs. I've got bacon and fresh biscuits too. Anyway, that's easy for you to make them. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins, Faith said, her stomach rumbling in anticipation as she settled onto a wooden chair. Everything smells wonderful. Call it a welcome feast," Mrs. Jenkins said. They chatted for a bit while the cook finished the meal, placing a plate piled high with eggs and bacon before Faith, along with a golden biscuit. "Eat up now, you'll need your strength." As Faith took her first bite, the flavors burst across her tongue, a delicious promise of the days to come. She smiled, feeling grateful not only for the food but also for the companionship that already seemed to be knitting itself around her in this new place. Nourished by the hearty breakfast, Faith pushed her chair back and nodded a final thanks to Mrs. Jenkins. Her fingers brushed against the soft fabric of her dress, a quilt pattern she'd stitched herself, before she stepped out onto the porch. The sun bathed the ranch in a warmth that seemed to welcome her. She descended the wooden steps. The land stretched before her, a vast canvas of greens and browns dotted with cattle and bordered by fences that marched toward the horizon. She wandered past the chicken coop where hens clucked and pecked at the ground, their busywork a comforting background to her stroll. Faith inhaled deeply, feeling the nervous flutter in her chest give way to a budding sense of belonging. Each step took her further into the heart of her new life. The stables loomed ahead, the wood old but sturdy, harboring the musky scent of animals and straw. Faith hesitated at the entrance, her eyes adjusting to the dimmer light within. Rows of stalls lined the interior, each one home to a horse with intelligent eyes and twitching ears that perked up at her approach. "Hey there," she murmured, reaching out a tentative hand to the nearest mare, a beautiful chestnut with a white blaze down its face. The horse nuzzled her palm, and a laugh bubbled up from Faith's throat, the sound mixing with the soft knickers around her. "Beautiful, aren't you?" Faith stroked the mare's mane, the coarse hair sliding between her fingers. She walked along the row of stalls, pausing to greet each horse, whispering words of admiration. Their warm breaths puffed against her skin, and for a moment, she imagined sharing this simple joy with Kane. "Bet you'd like a nice run later, huh?" she said to a spirited stallion that pranced lightly on his hooves. She smiled at the thought of galloping across the fields, wind tangling through her red hair, a freedom she had yet to taste. Faith lingered a while longer, feeling a kinship with these majestic creatures that seemed to echo her own spirit. They were like her in a way, strong, full of life, and now part of this sprawling family under the Texas sky. As she left the stables, the sunlight enveloped her once more, and she looked out over the land that was now hers to call home. A sense of peace settled within her. Faith meandered away from the stables. The Texas sun, though climbing higher by the minute, cast a gentle warmth over her shoulders, coaxing a smile onto her lips. Her green eyes sparkled with curiosity as she rounded a bend and stumbled upon a vibrant patchwork of colors. "Morning, ma'am," the woman greeted, her hands deep in the earth as she tended to a bed of blooming flowers. A straw hat shielded her face from the sun, but her eyes were bright and welcoming. "Good morning," Faith replied. "I'm Faith. And these are beautiful." "Thank you kindly." The woman wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "The heat can be rough on 'em, but they're hardy little things." "I'm Maggie, by the way." "Maggie Hughes. Like us women, I suppose," Faith chuckled, her fingers tracing the petals gently. "True enough," Maggie laughed, straightening up. "What brings you out this way?" "I wanted to get to know the place, feel its heartbeat," Faith said, standing. "There's so much life here." "Would you like a tour?" Maggie asked, her eyes twinkling. "I could show you around, tell you about the ranching bits and bobs." "Would you?" "That'd be wonderful." Faith's heart skipped with eagerness. "Follow me, then," Maggie said, leading Faith past the gardens. They walked side by side, Maggie pointing out the sprawling fields where the cattle grazed, the chicken coop that clucked with activity, and the far-off line of fences that marked the edge of their land. "Kane's proud of his Herefords," Maggie explained, nodding toward the grazing cows. "Took some time getting the herd just right." "I'd love to learn more about it all," Faith admitted, her voice tinged with genuine interest. "Ranching's tough work, but rewarding," Maggie said. "You'll fit right in." "Think so?" Faith watched a calf nuzzle its mother. "Sure as the sky is blue," Maggie assured her, with a knowing smile. "It's in your spirit." As they continued the tour, Faith felt a sense of belonging bloom within her. The sun-dappled barn loomed ahead, its weathered doors thrown open to welcome the day. Faith trailed behind Maggie, a smile playing on her lips as she stepped over the threshold and into the bustling world of ranch work. The scent of hay and leather mingled in the air, a comforting embrace that spoke of honest labor and long days under the Texas sky. "Morning, boys," Faith called out, and the ranch hands paused, their faces lighting up at the sight of the new bride. Mrs. Edwards, one doffed his hat, his cheeks creased by the sun. "Pleasure to have you with us." "Thank you," Faith replied, her eyes dancing with curiosity. "Maggie's showing me how things run around here." "Right as rain," the hand said. "This here's where the real work happens." They led her through the wide aisles between stalls, explaining their daily rituals, mucking out, feeding, grooming. Every horse had a name, every cow a place in the pasture. Each piece of the ranch puzzle clicked into place in Faith's mind, admiration growing for the men who worked from dawn's light to the evening's soft glow. "Lot to take in," Maggie remarked, watching Faith's rapt attention. "There is," Faith said, her red hair catching the sunlight that filtered in through the rafters. "But it's beautiful, all of it." "Kane thinks so too," Maggie said with a knowing nod. "You'll be part of this soon enough." "Can't wait," Faith said, though the thought sent a flutter through her chest. She left the barn with a wave, carrying with her the sights and sounds of a life she was only just beginning to understand. Back at the house, the sewing room beckoned, a cozy retreat, lined with fabrics and spools of thread. Maggie had mentioned it as they walked. It had been Kane's mother's. Faith settled at the wooden table, the quilt pieces laid out like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her fingers found their rhythm, needle dipping in and out of the cloth. With each stitch, she wove in her hopes and dreams, the fabric becoming a tapestry of her new life. "Red suits you," Maggie said from the doorway, a smile softening her weathered face. "Does it?" Faith asked without looking up, her hand steady with the familiarity of the task. "Like a sunset over the prairie," Maggie affirmed, her eyes twinkling. "It's good to see you settling in." "Feels like home," Faith murmured, her heart swelling with the truth of it. Here, amid the hum of the sewing machine and the gentle creak of the floorboards, she found solace. This house, this ranch, it was more than she'd dared to dream. "Wait till Kane sees this," Maggie chuckled, her gaze lingering on the intricate patterns. "Man doesn't know what treasure he's got." "Let's keep it our little secret for now," Faith said with a playful wink, lost once more in the dance of needle and thread. "Mind if I join you?" Kane's voice, rich and warm, filled the room. Faith looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "Of course not," she said, her smile blooming like the wildflowers outside. Kane leaned against the doorframe, watching as her hands worked the fabric. "I never knew quilting could look so artful," he admitted, his gaze admiring the quilt's emerging pattern. "Each piece tells a story," Faith said, her fingers not missing a beat. "Seems like a lot of love goes into it." Kane's words held a note of reverence. "Love is the best ingredient for most things," she replied, a playful edge to her tone. "Is that so?" He pushed off from the doorway and took a step closer, his brown eyes twinkling with interest. "Absolutely." She set down her needle and turned to face him fully, her red hair catching the light. "Then perhaps you'll love what I have planned," Kane suggested, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "And what's that?" Faith asked, curiosity piqued. "Come with me." Kane extended his hand, which she took without hesitation. Together, they left the cozy confines of the sewing room. Outside, the summer air was alive with the sounds of the ranch. 2 horses stood saddled by the fence, their manes shimmering in the afternoon sun. "Thought we might take a ride," Kane said, helping Faith mount one of the horses. "Sounds perfect." Faith settled into the saddle, feeling a sense of freedom as they trotted side by side. They rode in comfortable silence, the vastness of the ranch stretching out around them. Faith soaked in the sights, the rolling hills, the distant mountains, and the endless blue sky. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Kane broke the silence, gesturing at the landscape. "More than words can say," Faith agreed. As the horses ambled along, Kane shared tales of the land, his voice blending with the rhythm of hoofbeats. Faith listened, her laughter mingling with his, the bond between them growing with each shared story and glance. "Feels good to just be, doesn't it?" Kane asked as they slowed to a walk. "Better than good," Faith answered, her spirit soaring with the joy of the moment. Faith and Kane returned to the homestead. Faith's red hair caught the last rays of light, casting a fiery glow around her as she smiled at Kane. "Cook outdid herself," Kane said, leading Faith into the dining room where a feast awaited them. Roasted chicken with herbs, fresh biscuits, and a garden salad spread across the table. The aroma made Faith's mouth water. "Everything looks wonderful," Faith replied, taking her seat beside Kane. He served her with a gentle hand, his actions tender and considerate. They ate, their conversation peppered with laughter and shared glances that spoke volumes of the growing affection between them. "Never knew I could be this happy just eating dinner," Kane mused, his eyes twinkling in the candlelight. "Me neither," Faith admitted, her heart fluttering like the wings of a butterfly. She savored each bite, not only of the food but of the moment, the sense of belonging enveloping her. "What did you do today?" she asked. Kane's eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and contentment as Faith's question lingered in the air. He took a moment to savor the warmth of the candlelit room, the soft glow enhancing the peace that settled within him. "Well, my day was quite eventful," Kane began, his voice a gentle melody that wove through the cozy atmosphere. "I started at sunrise, checking on the cattle with old Joe. The herd seemed restless this morning, perhaps feeling the heat more than usual." Faith listened intently, her emerald eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight as she hung on to every word he spoke. "And did you manage to settle them down?" she inquired, her curiosity piqued. Kane chuckled softly, a sound that resonated like a comforting embrace in the room. "Took some time and patience, but eventually, they calmed down. Animals have their moods too, you know," he explained with a hint of amusement. "After the cattle were settled, I rode out to check on the new foals, with Tom. You should have seen them, Faith, playful and full of energy as they galloped around the pasture. It warms my heart to see life thriving on the ranch." Faith's eyes shimmered with delight at Kane's animated storytelling, her genuine interest in every detail evident. "I would love to see them one day," she expressed, a soft smile gracing her lips. Kane's gaze softened as he continued recounting his day, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and affection. "After tending to the foals, I met with the ranch hands to discuss some upcoming projects. We're planning to expand the north pasture for grazing, which will require some extra hands and resources. It's a big undertaking, but one that will benefit the herd in the long run." Faith nodded attentively, impressed by Kane's dedication to managing the ranch. "You have quite the responsibility, Kane, overseeing all these aspects of ranch life," she said. Kane's eyes met Faith's, a glint of pride shimmering in their depths. "It's a labor of love, Faith, one that I am grateful to share with you now," he confessed, his tone sincere and heartfelt. After dinner, they lingered at the table, reluctant to break the spell of their intimacy. But as the candles began to flicker, signaling the end of the evening, they rose together and made their way upstairs. In the privacy of their bedroom, Faith felt a tremble of anticipation. Kane's gaze held hers, warm and inviting. He stepped closer, his hands finding her waist. She looked up into his eyes, green meeting brown, and the world outside faded away. "Faith," he whispered, his voice low and full of emotion. "I think I'm the luckiest man alive." Her breath caught, and she reached up to touch his cheek. "And I feel like the most cherished woman," she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. Their kiss was slow, a delicate exploration that quickened both their pulses. As they deepened the embrace, Faith felt herself melting into him, her body alive with a desire she'd never known before. Kane's hands were gentle yet assured, guiding her with a passion that mirrored her own. In the quiet of the night, they gave themselves to each other, the bond between them strengthening with every caress, every sigh. "Faith," Kane murmured against her skin, "you brought life to my world." "And you to mine," she breathed in return, holding him close. The moon hung high, casting a serene glow through the window as Faith nestled closer into Kane's embrace. The room was quiet, save for their intertwined breaths and the distant chorus of crickets singing in the night. Her head rested on his chest. Today was More than I ever imagined, Faith murmured, tracing lazy circles on his arm. Every day with you will be, Kane replied, his voice a soft rumble that vibrated against her cheek. I'm already looking forward to tomorrow. Me too, she said, a smile playing on her lips. It felt like a dream, yet here it was, their reality. They lay in comfortable silence, the weight of the day's emotions easing into a tranquil lull. Faith closed her eyes, feeling the gentle caress of Kane's fingers through her red locks. In return, she let her own fingertips move over the hard muscles of his chest. Kane, she whispered, breaking the silence. He hummed, a sound that spoke of contentment. Thank you for being you. The words felt small, but they carried the depth of her gratitude. He chuckled lightly, the sound warming her from the inside out. And thank you for saying yes. You've turned my house into a home. Her heart swelled. This was a man who saw her not just as a wife, but as a partner and confidant. With him, she could imagine a future filled with laughter, challenges met together, and nights just like this one, wrapped in love's tender cocoon. Good night, Kane, she whispered. Sweet dreams, my darling Faith, he replied with a soft kiss atop her head. Chapter 5. Faith stirred in her bed. The scent of something delicious teased her senses, and her eyes fluttered open to find Kane standing by the bedside with a tray. Good morning, Kane said with his characteristic grin, setting down a breakfast spread that would rival any feast. Thought you might fancy breakfast in bed. Kane, Faith said, sitting up and tucking a stray red lock behind her ear, you shouldn't have. Her green eyes sparkled at the sight of freshly baked biscuits and a jar of homemade jam. Ah, but I wanted to, he replied, pushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. A good start for a day full of possibilities. Faith chuckled, taking in the simple yet thoughtful gesture. She reached for a biscuit, still warm from the oven. I think we'll need the energy if we're to explore the whole ranch today. Got it all planned out, Kane said, leaning against the wooden bedpost. We'll start at the stables, then make our way past the creek, and... Let me guess, Faith interjected with a playful tone, we'll end under the big oak for a picnic? Guilty as charged, he admitted, throwing up his hands in mock surrender. But that's only if you're up for it. Try and stop me, she replied, her laughter mingling with his. Then let's eat up, Kane said, joining her on the bed. We've got a big day ahead, Mrs. Edwards. We do, Mr. Edwards, Faith said. As Kane cleared away the breakfast tray, she smiled, but her eyes betrayed a wistfulness that clung to her like the summer heat outside. Kane, she began, tracing the stitches of the quilt, Erna and we'd spend hours just like this, piecing together bits of fabric, telling stories. She sighed, her thoughts meandering through the past. She has hands blessed for baking, you know? I can almost taste her peach cobbler. Kane sat beside her, his presence a comforting weight on the edge of the bed. It sounds like you two are very close, he said. Closer than you could imagine, Faith replied as a small laugh escaped her, mingling with the lingering scent of biscuits in the air. She cuts hair, crafts little wonders, and has a heart so big it makes the Texas sky seem small. Then let's bridge that sky, Kane suggested with an encouraging tilt of his head. You'll get to see her at church the day after tomorrow. Her green eyes found his, searching, hopeful. And will you mind if we spend time together? Only during the day while you're gone, of course. Absolutely, he affirmed with the certainty of sunrise. Thank you, Kane. Faith said. I can't wait to see her again. It felt like months since she'd seen her twin and not mere days. Good. Kane stood, offering his hand. For now, let's explore what's to be your canvas for new memories. Lead the way, Mr. Edwards, she said. Kane's eyes lit up with excitement as he took Faith's hand in his, leading her out of the cozy bedroom, through the house, and into the bright morning sunshine. The ranch sprawled before them, a vast expanse of rolling hills and sprawling fields that seemed to stretch on endlessly under the clear blue sky. Their first stop was the stables, where Kane introduced Faith to each of their horses by name, regaling her with stories of their quirks and personalities. Faith's laughter filled the air as she fed an apple to a particularly cheeky mare who nudged her playfully. Next, they wandered past the creek, its cool waters shimmering in the sunlight. Kane showed Faith the best fishing spots and where to find the sweetest wildflowers that dotted the banks. Faith trailed her hand in the water, wishing she dared to jump in fully clothed. Texas was even hotter than she'd imagined it would be. As they made their way toward the towering oak tree at the edge of the ranch, a checkered blanket tucked under Kane's arm, Faith couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the land spread out before her. The vibrant green of the fields danced in the summer breeze. Kane's eyes shone with pride as he watched Faith take in every detail, her face a canvas of wonder and joy. Under the sprawling oak tree's shade, with its ancient branches reaching toward the sky like nature's cathedral, Kane unfurled the blanket with a flourish. Faith settled down on the soft grass, feeling the earth beneath her with a contented sigh. The gentle rustle of leaves above and the distant murmurs of the creek formed a soothing backdrop to their picnic. Kane produced a wicker basket filled to the brim with delights: freshly baked bread, slices of cured meats, an array of cheeses, and ripe fruits that exuded sweetness. He poured them each a glass of chilled lemonade. As they indulged in the simple yet delicious feast, Faith couldn't help but admire the man beside her. Kane's eyes reflected a genuine happiness as he watched her savor each bite, his own plate untouched as if her enjoyment was all that mattered. "This land holds so much beauty," Faith remarked, a soft breeze tousling her vibrant red hair. "It does," Kane agreed. Faith leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder as they sat side by side under the tree. The rustling leaves created a dappled pattern of light and shadows dancing on their faces. "I never imagined such peace and serenity existed," Faith mused, her fingers lacing with Kane's. "Thank you for bringing me here." Kane turned to her, his expression tender. "It brought me joy, as I hope it did you." Faith stepped out onto the wide veranda, the wooden boards warm beneath her bare feet. Kane, with his easy smile and eyes reflecting the clear Texas sky, was already waiting for her. "Shall we?" he asked, extending an arm. She answered by slipping her hand into the crook of his arm. They descended the steps together, their footsteps synchronizing as they ventured toward the open expanse of land that surrounded the house. Faith couldn't help but admire the way the sunlight played upon Kane's closely trimmed beard, giving him an almost ethereal glow. "I love the horses." Faith pointed toward the corral where a group of mustangs grazed, their coats shimmering in the light. "They're magnificent." "Yes, they are," Kane agreed. "Would you like to ride again soon?" "I would," she said, remembering the feel of the wind in her hair. As they strolled, their conversation flowed naturally, and Faith found herself enjoying his presence more and more. "Did you have any favorite games as a child?" Kane asked, his tone light. "Erna and the other orphans, used to play hide and seek in the meadows," Faith chuckled, her green eyes sparkling with nostalgia. "I always found the best hiding spots." "I bet you did," Kane grinned. "I can see you now, a little ginger-haired imp impossible to find." She playfully swatted his arm. "And what about you? What mischief did young Master Edwards get into?" "More than my fair share," he confessed with a roguish wink. "There was this one time I convinced the stable boys to let me ride the stallion. Nearly gave my mother a heart attack." They laughed together, the sound mingling with the calls of distant birds and the whisper of the wind. The ranch was alive with the promise of new beginnings, its vastness a mirror to the breadth of possibilities that lay before them. "Speaking of the future," Kane said, his voice taking on a thoughtful edge, "what do you dream of, Faith? What's something you wish for yourself?" Her steps slowed as she contemplated the question, the horizon stretching out before them like a canvas awaiting paint. "To belong," she admitted softly. "And maybe to make something beautiful with my own two hands." "Then we shall make sure of it," Kane promised. "Together, we'll build a world where you always feel like you belong." Their walk continued, the sun climbing higher as they explored the edges of the ranch. They spoke of small things, of favorite foods and childhood memories, and of larger dreams yet to be realized. With each step, Faith felt more at ease, more tethered to the man beside her who had become not just her husband, but her partner. "Thank you, Kane," she said, squeezing his arm. "For this walk, for listening." "Thank you, Faith," he replied, meeting her gaze. "For being here, for being you. Sunlight dappled the path as Faith and Kane meandered back toward the ranch house. A gentle breeze stirred the wildflowers, sending delicate scents into the air. Kane, Faith said, breaking a moment of comfortable silence, back home I would spend hours sewing and quilting. It brought me such joy to see pieces come together, creating something new from the old. Kane glanced over at her, his brown eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond words. Are you happy with Mother's old sewing room? He asked. I adore it, but at times, I feel like I'm imposing on her special place. Her green eyes lit up, mirroring the brightening horizon. It's no imposition, he interjected, quick to ease her concern. I want you to have a space where you can chase your passion. Besides, it gives me an excuse to admire your handiwork, and Mother would have been pleased to see someone finding the same joy in the room that she did. A smile crept across her face, and she felt a warmth that had little to do with the summer sun. Thank you, Kane. Chapter 6. Faith Edwards stepped out into the stifling heat of a Texas summer morning, her red hair neatly styled and her green eyes sparkling with anticipation. She and Kane walked the short distance to the church, and she was both nervous and excited. She was never happy to meet new people, but she was so happy to be able to see her sisters again. Especially Erna, she'd felt like half of her was missing. The wooden pews of the church were already filling up when Kane led Faith inside. She craned her neck, looking for her sister while Kane chose a place for them to sit near the front of the church. And there she was, Erna. She wanted to squeal as she rushed to her twin. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. I feel like it's been months since I've seen you. Erna hugged her sister. I feel the same. Did you marry the night of the dance? Not until 2 days later. I married Kane Edwards. And you married, I can't remember his name. Erna laughed. Joel Trinity. He has a small ranch not far from here. Kane has a huge ranch not far from here. Come see me tomorrow. We can spend a little time together. I can't believe how much I miss you. I miss you too. Joel is a good man, and I'm happy to be married to him, but it would be nice if you could be right there. Kane is a good man as well. I like being married to him. Erna looked around for a second, dropping her voice to a whisper. And do you like the marriage bed? Faith blushed but nodded. I do. Far more than I thought I would. Amos, Hannah's husband, called for everyone to be seated. We'll talk after service, Erna said softly, and they each went to sit with their husbands. The last amen echoed as Faith and Kane stepped out into the bright day, the church's solemnity giving way to the cheerful clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the laughter of townsfolk. When they arrived back at the ranch, they were a few steps from the house when Faith could smell the Sunday dinner cook had made. Something smells amazing, Faith said, looking at Kane. I had cook make a Sunday dinner for us. I want Sundays to be special. Well, this one was special just because I saw my sister. Kane frowned for a moment before nodding. You're very close to Erna, aren't you? We're twins, she said simply. He studied her for a moment before nodding. Shall we? Kane motioned toward the dining room where the table was set with care. Absolutely, Faith replied, her stomach agreeing with a timely rumble. They settled into their respective chairs, the clink of silverware against fine china marking the rhythm of their meal. Today's sermon, quite the message, huh? Kane spoke between bites, his eyes never leaving Faith's face. It was, Faith replied, her eyes lighting up as she remembered the sermon. The preacher spoke about the importance of forgiveness and understanding in relationships. It made me think about how blessed we are to have each other. Kane nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I couldn't agree more. I believe that communication and respect are the cornerstones of a strong marriage. We should always strive to understand each other better. Faith smiled warmly at Kane, feeling grateful for his wisdom and care. I appreciate how you always listen to me and try to see things from my perspective. It means a lot to me. As they continued their meal, the conversation turned lighter, with Faith and Kane sharing anecdotes from their week and laughing over small mishaps on the ranch. After dessert, Faith leaned back in her chair. That was wonderful. Now what are we going to do with our Sunday afternoon? Kane pushed his empty plate aside. I was wondering if you'd like to go for a drive. It's too lovely a day to spend indoors. His offer held the same excitement as a child proposing an adventure. Her green eyes lit up. I'd love that. They left the remnants of the meal behind and found themselves in Kane's well-kept carriage, the horses stepping lively as they ventured out. The countryside unfurled before them, a tapestry of greens and golds stitched together under the Texas sun. As they neared the Trinity River, the world seemed to slow down, the ripples on the water catching the sunlight. Kane brought the carriage to a gentle stop, and they disembarked. Look at that view, he murmured, his gaze following the winding river. Faith stood beside him, the breeze teasing her red hair into a fiery halo. She breathed in deeply, contentment weaving through her as she took in the tranquil beauty of the water. Nature's own artwork, she agreed, the corners of her mouth tilting upward in a peaceful smile. Something to remember on less sunny days, Kane added, his side glance inviting her to share in the moment. Definitely, she whispered, her voice barely rising above the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. They stood and watched the water for a while, happy to simply be together. Kane led Faith back to the carriage after a while, his hand warm and steady in hers. The horses seemed to sense their contentment, walking smoothly as if to preserve the serenity of the afternoon. Faith rested against the plush seat, watching the world go by in a pleasant blur. Faith, Kane began, breaking the comfortable silence between them, I've been thinking. I'd like this to be a tradition for us. She turned her gaze to him, noting the earnestness in his eyes. A tradition? Sunday drives, he clarified with a nod. Even when we have little ones, I want us to explore the countryside, show them the beauty of our land. Children. The word hung between them, ripe with possibilities. She studied his face, so filled with enthusiasm it was contagious. But something within her wrestled with a quiet hesitation. How many little ones are you picturing on these drives? She asked, her voice laced with a gentle teasing. Ah, well, Kane's smile broadened, I suppose it's not up to me alone, but I do love the idea of a big family, maybe 15? He chuckled at her astonished expression. 15? Faith echoed, her heart skipping a beat. That's quite the number. Isn't it just? Kane laughed, his optimism undimmed. Imagine the laughter, the love. Our home filled to the brim. Love, certainly, Faith mused, but also quite the handful. She pictured a sea of faces, each a blend of Kane and herself, each needing love, guidance, attention. Every child would be a blessing, Kane said firmly, his confidence unshaken. Of course, she agreed softly, but her mind spun with images of children vying for attention, the way she had once done in a crowded, bustling house. Perhaps a smaller blessing to start, she suggested, hoping her compromise sounded as reasonable to him as it did to her. We'll find our perfect number, Kane assured her, reaching over to squeeze her hand. The wheels of the carriage crunched over the gravel as Kane guided the horses back toward home. Faith watched the horizon swallow the sun, casting a warm glow over the Trinity River. Her mind drifted, not to the splendid oranges and pinks painting the sky, but to the conversation that had unfolded earlier. 15 children. The number echoed in her head like the hymns from this morning's service. Quite the day, wasn't it? Kane broke the silence, his voice filled with contentment. It was, Faith replied, her thoughts still dancing around the picture of a future teeming with tiny feet and endless laughter. A foundling home of their own making, it seemed. Later, Faith found herself on the porch, the wooden swing gently creaking as she and Kane settled onto it. Kane, she began, her fingers idly picking at the frayed edge of her quilted skirt, I've been thinking. About our brood of little ones? He asked with a knowing smile, leaning back as if already picturing a yard full of children. Yes, about that. She hesitated, then met his gaze. I'm not certain I want as many as you do. Kane tilted his head, puzzlement knitting his brows. Why ever not? We're doing well enough, and there's plenty of room at the ranch. I know, but... Faith trailed off, unsure how to voice the swirling mix of fears and hopes inside her without revealing too much of her past. Talk to me, Faith, Kane urged gently, reaching for her hand. What's weighing on your heart? Her eyes searched his, finding only warmth and concern. She drew in a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening air. It's just. Well, I want to be sure we can give them all the love they need. That each one feels. Cherished. Ah, Kane said softly, squeezing her hand. They will be, Faith. Each and every one. Promise, she whispered, allowing herself to lean a bit closer to him. Promise, he said, as the stars above blinked to life. Faith's fingers fiddled with the hem of her dress, the soft fabric a contrast to the tangle of thoughts knotting her mind. She glanced up at Kane, who sat beside her on the porch swing, his body relaxed, his eyes reflecting the last light of dusk. Kane, she began, her voice barely more than a whisper in the stillness, I can't help but think about how I was raised. Mrs. Jackson, she did right by us all, but there were so many, and I. Her words faltered as she tried to gather them together like wildflowers in a meadow, each one delicate and significant. Go on, he encouraged, his tone steady and patient. She took a deep breath, emboldened by the supportive squeeze he gave her hand. I was just one of many, you see? Mrs. Jackson was wonderful, but she only had 2 hands, 1 heart. I felt loved, yes, but not special. Faith's eyes met his, brimming with an earnest hope that he would understand. I want our children to know they're more than just a part of a crowd, Kane nodded thoughtfully, taking a moment before responding. But Faith, love isn't about numbers or being spread too thin. It's about what we give, how we make them feel. Our children will know they're cherished because of how we treat them, not because of how many they are. Faith considered this, her heart feeling lighter with each beat, as if his conviction might just be enough for both of them. Can we really do that? She asked, her voice tinged with newfound optimism. We can, he replied, his smile speaking of a future filled with laughter and love. We will. Faith sat on the edge of their bed, her fingers absently tracing the quilted pattern of wildflowers and vines. The house was quiet, save for the gentle creak of the old wooden floorboards as Kane moved about, preparing for bed. She could hear the distant hoot of an owl outside, a soothing sound that usually eased her into slumber. But tonight, her mind was too crowded with thoughts to welcome sleep. Quite the day, huh? Kane's voice broke through her reverie as he sat down beside her, his body radiating a warmth that always seemed to draw her in. Quite the day, she echoed, her voice betraying none of the whirlwind inside her head. Thinking about what we talked about? His eyes searched hers, concern etched across his features. Thinking about 15 little ones running around, Faith admitted with a half-hearted chuckle, though the prospect felt more overwhelming than amusing. Faith, if anyone can handle it, it's you. Kane's thumb caressed her hand reassuringly. Maybe, she whispered, not quite able to muster the same certainty. 15 pairs of feet pounding through the house, 15 voices calling out, Mama, 15 little lives depending on her. Later, they settled under the sheet, Kane's breathing soon deepening into the steady rhythm of sleep. Faith turned onto her side, gazing at the moonlight spilling through the window, casting silver shadows across the room. She tried to imagine a house full of laughter and chaos, a table stretched long with enough chairs to seat a small army. Would they all feel loved? Truly special? Her heart fluttered at the image of tiny hands and bright eyes looking up at her, but doubt lingered like a stubborn cloud blocking the sun. Mrs. Jackson had done her best, yet Faith remembered the times she had wished for just one more bedtime story, one more moment of undivided attention. Can love really be enough? She whispered into the darkness, her question hanging unanswered in the stillness of the night. As much as she wanted to believe in Kane's vision of their future, the fear of being just another Mrs. Jackson to 15 children gnawed at her conviction. She lay awake, listening to the soft symphony of the countryside, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures in the brush. Each sound was a comforting reminder of the life they were building together, grounded in the fertile soil of love and companionship. But as the night wore on, and the stars marched slowly across the heavens, Faith couldn't shake the vision of a brood large enough to fill every corner of their home and her heart with equal parts joy and trepidation. Chapter 7. Faith sat at her sewing table, folding the fabric with care, her fingers moving over the quilt pieces as she sought out the perfect pattern to use. Each stitch was a testament to her dedication, neat, precise, and unwavering. "Quite the quilt you're making there," Kane's voice broke the stillness, his boots thumping a steady rhythm on the wooden floorboards as he entered the room. He leaned against the doorway, his brown hair catching the light, a good-natured smile playing on his lips. Faith glanced up, the corners of her green eyes crinkling with pleasure. "Kane, I didn't hear you come in." She patted the quilt fondly. "It's coming along. One more row of stitches, and this patch will be part of the whole." "Looks beautiful, Faith," he said, stepping closer to admire the array of colors and patterns that would soon wrap someone in warmth. "Your handiwork amazes me." "Thank you," she responded, a blush coloring her cheeks at the compliment. "It's nothing but simple stitches, really." "Simple, she says," Kane chuckled, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "If that's simple, I think I'm a novice at life." "Got to be better for her," Kane resolved, pushing off from the doorway. "She deserves that much." He knew that fixing this wasn't just about finding the quilt. It was about fixing the way they communicated. "Hey, Faith," he called, stepping out onto the porch, his voice gentle, seeking connection. She looked up, her eyes holding a silent question. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, offering a small, hopeful smile. "Sure," Faith replied, scooting over on the swing, making room for him. As Kane sat down beside her, they both gazed out at the fading light. It was a start, and sometimes, that was all you needed. The chatter and laughter of the social gathering at Brenda's house rippled through the air, like a gentle breeze. Faith twirled a lock of hair around her finger, her green eyes scanning the crowd for Kane, who was undoubtedly holding court among their friends. "Kane, you do tell the tallest tales," one of the ranchers said with a laugh, slapping Kane on the back as he recounted an exaggerated story of his latest adventure. "Only the tallest for the finest folks," Kane replied with a grin, his brown eyes twinkling with mischief, his voice carrying over the gathered guests. Faith approached, her hand smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "Kane, might we have a word?" "Of course," Kane said, excusing himself from the group. They stepped to the edge of the porch, away from the crowd but still within earshot. "Kane, about earlier." "Faith, I know what you're going to say." Kane's charming demeanor faltered, his words tumbling out in haste. "You want to visit Erna, and it's fine by me." "Kane, that's not it," Faith interjected, the confusion clear in her voice. "I don't understand why you think." "Because you always talk about how you need the space." Kane's voice rose unintentionally, his frustration bleeding into the conversation. "Space to breathe, not to leave." Faith's own voice matched Kane's in volume. "I don't want to go anywhere without you." Their argument, heated and raw, spilled out before the silent audience of their friends, turning heads and halting conversations. The air grew thick with tension, the jovial atmosphere of moments ago, dissipating like morning mist. "Faith, Kane's words trailed off as he took in the faces of their friends, each reflecting a mix of surprise and discomfort. He felt the weight of his misstep, the unspoken accusation hanging between them like a dark cloud. "Kane," Faith said softly, her eyes downcast, "let's not do this here." Her voice broke the spell, and the murmur of the gathering resumed, albeit subdued. "Right," Kane murmured. "I'm sorry, Faith. Truly." "Me too," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. They stood side by side, united in their embarrassment, the rift between them now a spectacle for all to see. "Let's just enjoy the party, okay?" Kane suggested, offering his arm in a gesture of peace. "Okay," Faith agreed, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow, her touch light but forgiving. Later, Faith and Kane left the warmth of Brenda's house, taking the path that led back to their own porch. There was a certain hesitancy in their steps, a silent admission that there were words yet unspoken, issues unresolved. Sitting together on the swing that squeaked gently with every push of their feet, they faced the sprawling Texas sky. "Kane," Faith began, "I reckon we've been dancing around the truth like it's a rattlesnake ready to strike." He looked at her, his brown eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Seems we have, Faith. And I can't help but feel it's mostly my doing." She shook her head. "It takes two to fight." I've got my share of the blame. I'm thinking maybe I expect you to read my mind when I haven't even given you the full story. Truth is, Kane confessed, rubbing the back of his neck, I get all tangled up inside when I think you might leave me. Makes me act a fool and say things I don't mean. Leave you? Faith's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Kane, this ranch, our life here. It's where my heart is. With you. She reached out, her hand finding his. But I get scared too. Scared that maybe I'm not enough, that my ways might be too plain for your liking. Faith, he said firmly, turning to her with a smile that chased away the shadows, you are more than enough. You keep me grounded, remind me of what's real and true. He squeezed her hand. I acted like a fool, and I'm going to do everything I can to fix that. Let's start anew, Kane. Let's promise to really talk, to listen. To be patient with each other. What do you say? Her green eyes searched his, hopeful. Sounds like a plan. His voice held the weight of sincerity. I reckon good communication's like mending fences, takes time and care, but it's worth every minute. We'll work on it together. Faith stood at the kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour as she rolled out pastry dough. It was Cook's day off, and she was hungry for something special. Kane leaned against the doorway, watching her with an appreciative smile, his brown hair catching the morning light. The air was filled with the homely scent of apples and cinnamon, and outside, the Fort Worth landscape basked in the summer's embrace. Need any help there? Kane asked, pushing off from the doorframe to join her. Actually, yes, Faith replied, looking up from her task, a few stray red locks framing her face. You could peel those apples for the pie. Consider it done, he said, rolling up his sleeves and picking up a knife. He set to work, peeling the apples with a concentration that was both endearing and new. Careful now, don't take too much of the apple away with the skin, Faith instructed gently, glancing over at his hands. Like this? Kane held up an apple for her inspection. Perfect. Faith smiled. Their eyes met, and there was a warmth there, a silent understanding that they were not just making a pie, but mending their relationship one slice at a time. Tell me about your quilting project. The one for your other sister. What's her name again? Kane asked after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. Ah, the quilt, Faith sighed, her brow furrowing slightly. It's for Jane. She didn't come with the rest of us, and I want to welcome her with something special. Kane paused, his actions slowing as he listened. Sounds like a labor of love. Sorry it went missing. That's all right, she replied, softening. It's strange that I've lost two now, though. They continued their tasks, moving around each other in the cozy kitchen with an ease that spoke of growing familiarity. When the pie was finally assembled and placed in the oven, they sat at the wooden table, hands wrapped around mugs of coffee, the heat barely registering in their comfort with each other. Kane, Faith began hesitantly, I've been thinking about how we communicate. I'm going to try to be clearer about what I mean. No more beating around the bush. I appreciate that, he nodded. And I'll work on not jumping to conclusions. I think I've got a lot to learn about listening. Looks like we're both students then, she chuckled, her green eyes sparkling with mirth. Best kind of learning, if you ask me, Kane agreed, the corners of his eyes crinkling with his smile. Faith nodded at the clock. It's time. As Kane opened the oven door, the delicious aroma of baked apple and pastry filled the room. They shared a look of accomplishment, their earlier miscommunications dissolving. Guess we make a pretty good team, huh? Kane said, his voice warm with affection. The best, Faith replied, reaching for a towel. Now let's see if our pie tastes as good as our teamwork. Faith leaned against the porch railing, her red hair catching the golden hue of the setting sun. Kane stood beside her, his gaze following the path of a lone hawk soaring in the sky. The day's work was done, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. Sorry I got so riled up about the quilt, Faith said. I should have known you wouldn't toss it out. Kane turned toward her, his brown eyes meeting hers. And I'm sorry for jumping to conclusions earlier. I think we both let our tempers get the best of us. Faith nodded, her lips curving into a tentative smile. Guess we're learning together. Communicating isn't as easy as I thought it was. Sure isn't, he chuckled, stepping closer. But I think we're getting the hang of it. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. We are, aren't we? More than just getting the hang, Kane affirmed, encircling her waist gently with his arm and drawing her near. We're building something stronger, Faith. Their bodies closed the space between them, and they shared an embrace that felt like coming home. Faith's head rested against Kane's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Promise me something? Faith murmured, looking up at him. Anything, he replied earnestly. Let's keep talking, no matter what. Even when it's hard. Talking, listening, whatever it takes. Kane kissed the top of her head, sealing their unspoken pact. They stayed wrapped in each other's arms, the world around them quiet except for the occasional call of a night bird. As they watched the last rays of sunlight dip below the distant hills, there was a sense of peace between them. Tomorrow's a new day, Faith whispered, feeling the truth of her words deep in her bones. Full of new chances, Kane agreed, his voice laced with hope. Chapter 9. Kane, how can you stand there and question my heart? Faith's hands were balled into fists at her sides, her green eyes burning with hurt. I thought you knew me better than that. Her red hair, usually so carefully pinned up, had come loose in her agitation, framing her face like a fiery halo. Kane, lean and elegant even in his anger, stood like a pillar before her. Faith, he said, his voice tight with frustration, it's not about knowing you. It's about protecting what's mine. Yours, she exclaimed, her neat freak tendencies forgotten as she gestured wildly, her voice rising. Since when did feelings become something you own? Since people started pretending for the sake of land and money, he shot back, the charm in his voice replaced by a sharp edge. Is that what you think this is? A pretense? Faith's fingers trembled. Isn't it? Kane challenged, his closely trimmed beard doing little to hide the hard set of his jaw. Kane Edwards, I have never cared for your money or your land. Faith took a step closer, her gaze never wavering from his. Faith, her name on his lips was like a plea, softening the lines around Kane's eyes. She could see the battle within him, the war between doubt and desire. Look at me, Kane. Really look at me. She reached out tentatively, as if touching a skittish horse. Do I seem like someone who doesn't know her own heart? He met her gaze then, truly seeing her, the woman who loved her family fiercely, who found joy in tidy seams and neatly folded fabrics, who asked for nothing more than honesty and kindness. Your eyes, Kane's voice trailed off, and for a moment, the weight of the silence hung between them. Faith, he said, but his voice faltered. Doubts swirled like dust devils in his mind, each one whispering suspicions, sowing seeds of distrust. Could she truly love a man like him? A man who had never needed to dirty his hands with labor, who had wealth thrust upon him along with a lonely estate that echoed with the laughter of parties long since faded. Kane? Faith's voice was softer now, pulling him from his turbulent thoughts. Faith, he said again, his voice stronger this time, I'm scared. Scared that I'm just convenient. She faced him, her expression open and honest. In that silence, they both understood that what they were fighting for was more than pride, it was the chance to build a future together, that wasn't bound by fear or doubt. Faith felt the silence of the moment swell around them. It took every ounce of courage she had not to let the fear take hold, but she refused to let this be the end of their story. Her hand smoothed the front of her apron, a nervous habit, and she took in a deep breath, the hot Texas air doing little to cool her anxious heart. Kane, she said, her voice low but determined as she stepped closer, we can't let this silence speak for us. She looked up into his eyes, searching for the man who danced with life, not the shadow standing before her now. He remained still, like an oak stubborn against the wind, his brown eyes holding on to something unseen. Kane, Faith tried again, her voice trembling despite her resolve. Look at me, really look at me. Do you truly think I don't care for you? That all this, she gestured between them, her hand shaking, is just for convenience? Her green eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She wanted him to see past his doubts, to understand that her heart had found its match in his. Every stitch I make, every quilt I piece together, it's all about putting love into something lasting. Don't you see? You're no different. Not something to fix, but someone to cherish. Kane's gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, Faith feared she'd lost him. But she wouldn't give up, not on them, not on the hope of what they could build together. Please, Kane, she said softly, trust in us. Believe in me. In my love for you. Kane felt the light touch on his arm, as if a single thread from one of Faith's quilts reached out to stitch the divide between them. Her plea hung in the sultry air, thick with the promise of rain. Trust is a luxury, he murmured. The words that had seemed so solid in his chest now felt hollow, shaken loose by the tremble in her voice. Her hand fell away from him, but her eyes remained steadfast, locked onto his. In them, he saw not just the reflection of the sprawling Edwards ranch that was his legacy, but also the quiet strength of the woman before him. She stood like the sturdy oaks that lined the creek, unyielding in her resolve. Kane, I am not asking for silver or gold, she said. I'm asking you to believe in something more precious than land and cattle, he asked, attempting to cloak his vulnerability with a hint of his usual humor. But even as the words left his lips, they lacked their customary lightness. Much more, Faith replied, her voice firm, yet layered with affection. I'm talking about us. Us. The word echoed in Kane's mind, a striking contrast to the solitary life he had always known. A life of supervising ranch hands, attending social gatherings where he charmed others, yet returned home to a silent house that echoed with memories rather than laughter. With Faith, it could be different. He could be different. Her courage in facing him, in laying bare her heart, made him question whether the walls he had built around his own were truly as necessary as he once believed. For a long moment, Kane wrestled with his pride, the same pride that had seen him through loss and led him to success. It whispered warnings of caution, but in the face of Faith's unwavering gaze, its grip weakened. Faith, he finally said, his voice a rough-hewn whisper, it's not easy, dropping the reins when you've been holding them tight all your life. Then let's hold them together, she offered simply, extending her hand once more. Kane stared at her outstretched hand. Slowly, Kane reached out, his fingertips grazing hers before settling into her grasp. His doubts, though not entirely vanquished, receded like shadows at the edge of a lantern's glow. In their place, a fragile glimmer of hope flickered to life. All right, Faith, he conceded, his voice steady now, edged with the beginnings of optimism. Let's see where this road can take us. Kane's hand lingered in Faith's, a silent testament to the battle raging within him. He drew a deep breath, the summer's heat less oppressive than the weight of his fear. Faith, Kane began, his voice laced with a vulnerability that felt foreign on his tongue. I reckon I've been a fool, a blind fool. He swallowed hard, the admittance squeezing tight in his throat. Doubting you. Unwarranted and unfair. Have you had a bad experience with a woman who only wanted your wealth? Faith, Kane started, the words pouring out like a dam breaking. There was a woman once. A lady from Dallas, named Eloise. She had eyes like sapphires, and a smile that could charm the devil himself. I thought I was in love with her, blinded by her beauty and grace. Faith listened intently, her heart aching for the pain she heard in Kane's voice. But as our courtship progressed, I began to see cracks in her facade, Kane continued, his gaze distant with memories. She cared more for the jewels I gifted her than the time we spent together. She never cared for the ranch or the land that meant everything to me. It became clear that she sought my wealth, not my heart. The weight of Kane's confession hung heavy in the air. I was devastated, Faith, Kane admitted, his vulnerability laid bare before her. I thought I had found love, but it was a charade, a cruel trick disguised as affection. I swore then to never let myself be fooled again, to never trust blindly. Faith's heart constricted at the pain in Kane's eyes, the remnants of a wound she hadn't known existed until now. She reached out and clasped his hand tighter, anchoring him to the present moment. Kane, she whispered, her voice gentle yet resolute, I'm not Eloise. I didn't marry you for your wealth or your possessions. I married you for the man you are, the man who showed me kindness at a dance. Kane searched her emerald eyes, seeking the truth he so desperately yearned to believe. Faith, he began, his voice tinged with uncertainty, how can I be sure? How can I know that history won't repeat itself? Faith's grip on his hand tightened, her gaze unwavering. Because, she said softly, I am not Eloise. I do not seek your wealth or your land. What I desire is your trust, your love, not the material possessions you own. Kane's heart swirled with conflicting emotions, the fear of being hurt again battling against the longing for a true connection. He studied Faith's face, searching for any trace of deceit, but all he found was sincerity shining in her eyes. I want to believe you, Kane confessed quietly, his walls starting to crumble under Faith's unwavering honesty. But my past haunts me, Faith. The scars from Eloise's betrayal run deep. Faith leaned in closer, her breath mingling with his in the warm summer air. Let me heal those wounds, Kane, she urged. Let me show you that my feelings for you are real, that I am here for you, not for what you can provide but for who you are. I cannot erase the pain of your past, but I can promise you a future filled with trust and companionship. Kane felt a surge of emotion welling up inside him, a mix of longing and caution as he gazed at Faith. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the shadows of doubt might still linger in his heart, but he also felt a glimmer of hope igniting within him. With a deep breath, Kane finally spoke, his voice raw with emotion. Faith, I want to trust you. I want to believe in us. Will you help me learn to open my heart again, to let go of the fear that binds me? Faith's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she nodded, her own voice thick with emotion. I will stand beside you through all life's storms. He looked down into her eyes, and he thought she was telling him the truth, but he'd believed Eloise was as well. Kane, she said, you're scared, and I see that now. But so am I. She took a step closer, bridging the gap his doubts had carved between them. Forgiveness is already yours. Always has been. His chest tightened at her words, a mix of relief flooding through him. Here was this woman, standing before him, offering not just forgiveness, but her steadfast commitment. Suppose we've both got some learning to do, Kane said, the corners of his mouth twitching into a sheepish smile. Suppose so, Faith agreed, a gentle laugh escaping her. But I'm thinkin' we'll manage just fine. Kane's hand, rough from reins and rope, was a contrast to Faith's smooth fingers as they met in an uncertain grip. With the weight of his fears lifted, he reached out and drew her into an embrace, his arms tentative at first, but growing sure as she melted against him. Kane, Faith murmured, neither of us were born the moment we met. We will learn about each other, and we will adjust. I like that. And we can give each other grace as we do. Exactly, Faith agreed, a smile in her voice. As long as we keep choosing to care for one another, there's nothing that can keep us apart. From now on, Kane said, pulling back just enough to look into Faith's eyes, I vow to speak my heart. No more hiding behind doubts. And I'll listen, Faith replied, her green eyes shining with resolve, with ears wide open and heart ready to understand. Sounds like exactly what I need, he whispered. And I'll do the same for you. Perfect, she said. Chapter 10. Faith swept a few stray strands of red hair behind her ear as she straightened the quilts draped artfully over the back of the sofa. Her gaze lingered on the tidy space before settling on Kane, who stood in the doorway, his brown hair catching the light. Let's sit out on the porch, Kane, Faith suggested, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. It's cooler there. He nodded, the corners of his mouth turning upward in that charming way of his. Together, they stepped into the lingering heat of the Texas summer, finding respite in the shade of the wide porch that wrapped around the house. The wooden swing creaked gently as they settled side by side, the open expanse of the ranch stretching before them. Faith, I think we've been like two cats in a sack lately, Kane began, his tone free from its usual levity. He looked at her, his eyes earnest. She took in a deep breath, appreciating his willingness to break their silence. I know, Kane. Seems like every word between us has been sparking fire. Is it the heat or is it us? He asked, a hint of humor in his voice, despite the gravity of their conversation. Both, I guess. I hope we won't be this crabby with each other in the winter. She managed a small smile, green eyes meeting his gaze directly. But it's mostly us. Can't argue with that, he conceded. I want to listen, really listen to what's bothering you, without jumping to conclusions. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping lightly. Her heart swelled at his gesture of peace. And I'll do the same. We've got to give each other a fair shake if we're going to get past this rough patch. Agreed. Kane leaned back, the swing responding with a soft groan. They sat for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts. Faith broke the silence, her voice low. You start, then. Tell me what's eating at you. Kane turned to her, the weight of his concerns briefly shadowing his usually bright expression. All right, here goes. Her green eyes, usually so bright with merriment, now held a sheen of hurt as she looked across at Kane. Kane, she began, the word hanging between them, when you doubt me, when you question my feelings for you, it feels like a thorn in my heart. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small on the wide porch swing. I know money comes easy to you, and I've got nothing but these hands. Faith held them out, palms up, calloused from needlework, but what I feel for you, it's real. He was silent for a moment, his gaze never leaving hers. His brown hair caught the last light of day, and his closely trimmed beard seemed to frame his thoughtful expression. This was not the charismatic man who held court at social gatherings. This was Kane, vulnerable and bare. Faith, he said softly, I never meant for my own fears to hurt you. He reached out, hesitating just a breath before laying his hand over hers. It's hard to think that someone could want me for me, not for the Edwards name or the ranch, but hearing you say your feelings are real, it gives me hope that maybe I'm more than my inheritance. More than your inheritance? Faith echoed, a sad smile touching her lips. Kane, to me, you're the sunrise after a storm. Your laughter on a quiet evening. You're every good thing that ever walked into my life. Even when I get all high and mighty? Kane's voice had a teasing lilt, but his eyes were earnest. Especially then, she replied, a genuine smile breaking through. Because even then, you're honest. And that's worth more than any land or money. Kane shifted slightly, creating a small space between them on the swing. He cleared his throat gently, eyes fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped lower. Faith, he said, turning toward her with an openness that felt new, what can I do to show you I trust your heart? I mean, truly? She considered his question, her fingers tracing the wood grain. Ask me about my day, my dreams, she suggested softly. Talk to me about anything and everything, except money and land. Is it that simple? Kane's brow furrowed in thought. Sometimes, simplicity is the truest form of intimacy, she replied. Kane nodded slowly, taking in her words. And what do you need from me to feel secure in our marriage? Your patience, she said quickly, her green eyes meeting his. I'm not used to this grand life of yours. It's like learning to dance without knowing the steps. I can be patient, he promised, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And perhaps we can learn the steps together? Perhaps, Faith echoed, her smile mirroring his. Can we agree then, Kane ventured, to be more open with each, to ask before assuming? Agreed, she affirmed, and let's also promise to give each other the benefit of the doubt. Fair enough. Kane's expression relaxed into one of contentment. You know, I think we're getting better at this. Practice makes perfect, Faith quipped back, the ease between them growing as the sky turned to dusk. Then let's practice every day, Kane said, his gaze earnest. Starting now. Starting now, she agreed. Faith twisted a loose thread from her skirt between her fingers, the gesture grounding her as she sat beside Kane on the porch swing. Crickets chirped their nightly serenade while the humid air of the Texas summer clung to their skin. Kane, she began hesitantly, her voice barely rising above the creak of the swing, I've been thinking about all those times I jumped to conclusions. About you, about us. I didn't trust enough. He turned to her, his brown eyes reflecting the growing silver of the moon. And I let my fears dictate how I saw you, not for who you are, but as a threat to what I have. He shook his head, a rueful smile touching his lips. Seems we both got some learning to do. Plenty, Faith agreed with a soft chuckle. But we're willing, aren't we? More than. Kane reached out, taking her hand gently in his. His palm was rough against her own, but it was warm and reassuring. Look at us, she said, the corners of her mouth lifting into a smile, two fools stumbling through love like it's a barn dance in the dark. Maybe so, Kane replied, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. But at least we're dancing together now. Faith, Kane said after a moment, turning toward her with an earnestness that made her heart flutter, I want to be the man you deserve. One who stands by you, always. And I want to be the woman who supports you. She squeezed his hand, their intertwined fingers a testament to the bond they were building. We'll get there, won't we? With you, I reckon we're already halfway there. His smile was genuine, reaching his twinkling eyes. Only halfway, she teased, her spirit lightening. All right, maybe more than halfway, he conceded, laughter in his voice. Good, Faith said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Because I'm quite fond of this journey we're on, bumps and all. Me too, Faith. Me too, Kane whispered, as the swing continued its gentle sway, their hearts finding harmony in the simple, quiet night. Kane reached for Faith's hand, his grip firm yet tender. The swing beneath them creaked softly as they both found a rhythm in the stillness of the night. Kane, she began, her voice steady, I can't tell you how much it means to me, this chance we're giving us. Kane's gaze met hers, brown eyes softening with affection. Faith, there's nothing more important to me than what we have. These bumps. We'll get past them. Together. And when we have our 15 kids, we'll be able to stand united. She laughed. Are you still set on 15? That sounds like a lot to me. Maybe 6 or 7 instead. How could we do that to our children? They deserve a big family. Are you sure they do? Oh, yes. I'm positive. I was an only child, and I felt lonely so often. My parents were busy with each other. Look at the close relationship you have with all your sisters. She nodded reluctantly, not wanting as many children as he did, but realizing it was all in God's hands anyway. I guess God will let us know how many we will ultimately have. Are you planning to argue with God about this? Their laughter mingled. She felt as if things were becoming easier between them, and she was thankful for it. Thank you, Kane, Faith murmured, squeezing his hand. For being willing to work through this mess with me. Thank you, Faith, for never giving up on us, Kane replied. His other hand came to rest gently on her cheek, brushing a stray red curl behind her ear. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment to savor the tenderness they shared. When she opened them again, she saw not just the man who carried the weight of wealth and expectations, but the man who held her heart with careful hands. They stood then, moving closer until they were wrapped in each other's arms. Faith rested her head against Kane's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His embrace was a sanctuary, a place where doubts dissolved and hope bloomed anew. I do want our marriage to work, Kane whispered, his breath warm against her hair. I do too, she whispered back. Faith, with a playful glint in her eye, nudged the front door shut behind them. You know, I think we've done enough serious talking for one day, she said, her voice light as she tilted her head toward Kane. Kane raised an eyebrow, the corners of his mouth quirking up. Oh? And what do you propose we do instead, Mrs. Edwards? His boots clunked against the wooden floor. Race you to the bedroom. Faith declared, already darting off with surprising speed for a woman in a full skirt. Hey now. Kane's protest was half-hearted, laughter spilled from him as he took off after her. They threaded through the house like two children playing tag, dodging around the sturdy furniture. As they burst into the bedroom, Faith threw herself onto the bed with triumph. Beat you. Only because you got a head start, Kane huffed, though the teasing tone in his voice gave away his good humor. He plopped down beside her on the bed. Admit it, you let me win, she said, nudging him gently with her shoulder. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Kane winked at her, the gesture so boyish it made her heart flutter. Can't have my wife thinking she's losing her touch. Is that so? Faith leaned back, looking at him with mock seriousness. Well, Mr. Edwards, just for that, you're on cooking duty the next time Cook takes off. Hope you remember how to make biscuits without burning them. Kane groaned exaggeratedly, but there was no hiding the twinkle in his eyes. I'll have you know my biscuits are spoken of far and wide. Sure, they are. Faith laughed. And pigs can fly. Guess I'll have to prove it to you then, he said, accepting the challenge. But if I succeed, I expect full bragging rights at breakfast. I guess that works, she agreed, rolling to her side and kissing him softly. He didn't need an invitation to do what came naturally, and he wrapped his arms around her, deepening the kiss. This part of marriage came easily for them both. Chapter 11. Faith fussed with the hem of her apricot dress, the fine stitches a testament to her deft fingers. She shielded her green eyes from the sun's glare, watching Kane stride toward her. Faith, Kane called out, I've been thinking. She met him halfway, curious about the glint of excitement in his brown eyes. What's on your mind, Kane? Let's throw a grand party, he announced, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace the whole of Texas. Just like my folks used to have. For a moment, she forgot the heat. A party? Yep. We'll invite everyone, make it a celebration for all our friends and family. His grin was infectious, and despite herself, Faith felt a bubble of laughter rise within her. Actually, she said, tucking a stray lock of red hair behind her ear, that sounds perfect. Jane will be here in a week. It would be a good way to welcome her to Texas. Jane's finally coming? Kane's eyebrows lifted, and his smile widened. Well, then, it's settled. We'll plan for when she arrives. A proper Texas welcome. Kane, that's a wonderful idea. Faith's heart warmed at the thought of her sister joining them. Let's make it memorable, Kane said, tipping his hat back slightly. Memorable it shall be, Faith said. She could already picture the lanterns swinging gently in the evening breeze, hear the laughter and music, see the joy in Jane's eyes. Yes, a party, she thought, would be just the thing. Kane leaned against the porch railing, a piece of paper in one hand and a pencil in the other. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard as he turned to Faith with an expectant look. Now, what do you reckon we should feed this hungry horde coming our way? Faith thought for a moment, her green eyes bright with ideas. Well, we'll need something hearty. How about beef brisket? And we'll get Amy to bake some pies. And Erna can bake a huge cake. Brisket, pie, and cake, Kane repeated, nodding as he scribbled down the words. Sounds like a fine start. And I reckon some of Cook's potato salad would be good with it all. Of course, she agreed, her lips curving into a smile at the memory of past picnics. And we can't forget the peach cobbler. Wouldn't dream of it. Kane's voice was light, his eyes crinkling at the corners with amusement. And bread. We can't forget bread. And maybe some baked beans? They continued back and forth, the list growing as they added coleslaw, and a hearty stew for those who might fancy something different. With their plans set, Faith excused herself to the kitchen, where the warmth from the stove did little to compete with the heat outside. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing freckled arms that had known both the delicate work of quilting and the more robust tasks of homemaking. Opening her recipe book, she checked her pantry, ensuring she had all that was needed for the culinary undertaking ahead. Let's see now, she muttered to herself, ticking off items on her list. Flour, sugar, eggs, all present and accounted for. Her thoughts strayed to Jane and how she'd react to the spread. Would it remind her of home or mark the beginning of new traditions? Kane, she called out, poking her head through the doorway. Could you fetch me some peaches from the market tomorrow? And maybe some extra butter? Anything for you, came the cheerful reply, the words drifting in from the dusky light outside. He jotted another note, then tucked the pencil behind his ear, his brown hair tousled by the breeze. Thank you, she said, her heart light. As she turned back to the kitchen, her mind was ablaze with recipes and plans, but more so with the joy of creating something beautiful, not just the party or the food, but a life here, together, with Kane. Next Saturday, then, she whispered to the bubbling pot before her. A feast to remember. Cook walked into the kitchen then to start supper. Faith briefly explained their plans and what they wanted to serve for the party. Cook's face lit up with excitement. I haven't cooked for a big party since Mr. and Mrs. Edwards passed away. This will be fun. The sun had just begun to climb the sky when Faith stepped into the whitewashed chapel, her red hair tied back and green eyes bright with anticipation. As she made her way to the wooden pew where her sisters were gathering, the air was rich with murmurs and the scent of freshly pressed linen. Morning, y'all, Faith greeted the group of women, their faces lighting up at her presence. Good morning, Faith, they chorused back, making room for her on the bench. Say, I've got exciting news, Faith began, unable to keep the smile from her voice. Kane and I are hosting a grand party next Saturday, and I'd be tickled pink if each of you could come. A ripple of excitement passed through the group as they nodded and assured her they wouldn't miss it for the world. The joy in their voices wrapped around Faith like a warm quilt, filling her with a glow that only sharing good news with loved ones could bring. As the pastor began his sermon, Faith's twin, Erna, leaned close enough for their shoulders to touch. You're beaming like the morning sun, sis, she whispered, her own happiness reflecting Faith's. Ah, well, Faith replied, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. Kane and I have had our share of squabbles, but we're finding our way. Love's road is seldom smooth, but it's worth the journey, Erna whispered back, squeezing Faith's hand. Indeed, Faith whispered, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She turned her attention back to the preacher, thoughts of the upcoming celebration dancing in her mind like fireflies at dusk. As the last amen echoed through the small wooden church, the congregation began to disperse into clusters of conversation and fellowship. Faith found herself swept up in the tide of bonnets and Sunday best toward the open doors, where sunshine bathed the steps in a golden hue. Faith, wait up! Erna called out, her voice threading through the hum of voices like a familiar melody. She caught up to her twin with an eager skip in her step. I've been thinking about your party. How about I bake one of my special vanilla pound cakes for it? Oh, Erna, that'd be wonderful! Faith exclaimed, her eyes brightening at the thought. Your baking's always the talk of any gathering. I'm glad you offered, because I was going to ask you anyway. Then it's settled, Erna said, her grin as wide as the Texas horizon. I'll come over early and get started on it. Thank you, truly. Faith reached into the small satchel she carried and pulled out a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. Speaking of special, I made something for you. Erna's eyes widened with curiosity as Faith unfolded the cloth to reveal a miniature quilt, meticulously stitched in an array of vibrant colors. It was just the right size for the dollhouses Erna kept building. Faith, it's beautiful, Erna breathed, her fingers tracing the tiny patterns. You always had such a knack for making things cozy. Every home, no matter how small, deserves a touch of warmth, Faith replied, watching her sister's delight. Seems to me like you're putting a lot of warmth into this party, Erna observed, her gaze lifting to meet Faith's. Kane's idea, Faith admitted. But I'm finding joy in it, too. Feels like we're working together to make something lovely. It will be a good way to welcome Jane to Texas. It will be good to have her here with the rest of us, Erna said with a knowing nod. I think so too, Faith agreed, linking her arm with Erna's as they stepped out into the sun-drenched afternoon. Together, they walked down the church steps, their hearts light and their spirits high with anticipation for the week to come. Kane watched from a distance as Faith and Erna walked side by side, their laughter mingling with the buzz of the congregation milling around outside the church. He felt a pang of jealousy, seeing them so close, an unspoken language flowing between them. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if Faith might ever look at him with the same affection she held for her sister. Ridiculous, he muttered to himself, shaking his head as he approached the pair. The two sisters were discussing the size of the cake Erna planned to bake for the party, and Kane couldn't help but smile at their earnestness. Morning, ladies, Kane said, tipping his hat in greeting. Erna, your cake ideas sound grander than the church bell. Good morning, Kane, Erna replied with a grin. I do hope my baking skills are up to the task. Of course they are, Faith chimed in, her green eyes sparkling with confidence. You'll have everyone wanting seconds, before they've finished their first slice. Speaking of tasty treats, Kane interjected, why don't you all come over for Sunday dinner? We can talk more about the party plans then. Sounds wonderful, Joel said, joining the group with a firm nod. His presence was like a steady oak, strong and reassuring. We'd be glad to join you. Perfect, Kane replied, feeling a sense of camaraderie as they all shared a moment of agreement. After the church service, the afternoon unfolded with a leisurely pace as they gathered at the house for Sunday dinner. The table was set with simple elegance, plates piled high with roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, and bread still warm from the oven. Conversation flowed easily, peppered with laughter and the clinking of cutlery. Everything tastes amazing, Joel complimented, his voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation. I can't take the credit, Faith said. Cook did all the work. But you told her what you wanted her to make, Kane said, earning an amused smile from Faith. The meal concluded, and they decided to take advantage of the remaining daylight for a ride through the surrounding countryside. The horses were saddled, and they set off, the Texas landscape stretching out before them. Feels good to be out here, Faith said, her red hair catching the sunlight as they rode side by side. It does, Kane agreed, casting a glance her way. The sight of her so free and content made something inside him settle. Whatever doubts he had harbored earlier vanished. Dusk settled over the ranch, and Faith stood on the porch, watching Erna and Joel depart, their carriage a dwindling silhouette against the vast expanse of the countryside. A gentle breeze played with strands of her red hair, and she drew in a deep breath, her heart full to bursting. Kane, she said, turning to face him as he stepped out onto the porch beside her, today meant more to me than I can rightly say. He leaned against the railing, his brown eyes reflecting the fading light. You don't need to thank me, Faith. Seeing you this happy is all the thanks I need. Her green eyes met his, shining with gratitude. But it's more than that. Letting Erna spend the day with us. You've shown me kindness that goes beyond words. Kane reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips, with a tenderness that sent warmth through her. I married you for companionship, not to keep you from the ones you love. Your sisters, they're part of who you are. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, and she squeezed his hand. You're a good man, Kane Edwards. Only because I have a good woman by my side. His voice was light, but the sincerity behind it was as solid as the earth beneath their feet. And as for Erna, well, I don't think I would ever come between the two of you. Promise? She asked, half teasing, half serious. Cross my heart, he replied, his charisma wrapped in the simple honesty of the moment. Faith smiled up at him, moving into his embrace to rest her head on his shoulder. Thank you for understanding. When Faith went into her sewing room first thing the following morning, she decided to tidy things up, and as she moved a bolt of fabric to a new spot, she saw them. Her missing quilts were right there. She frowned. She owed Kane a huge apology, and she would make sure it happened as soon as she saw him. How had she put something on top of them and lost them? Chapter 12. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Erna, with her apron already dusted in flour, set to work in the warm kitchen of the house. Today was no ordinary day. It was the day of the party, and she had promised a cake, not just any cake, but a centerpiece that would be remembered for gatherings to come. Erna, you sure got here early, Faith observed, her green eyes twinkling with a mix of excitement and mild concern as she brushed an errant lock of red hair from her forehead. She moved around the kitchen, tidying up spaces that were already immaculate. Earliest bird catches the best oven heat? Erna said, giggling as she whisked eggs. Or the best company, Faith replied, leaning against the doorway to watch her sister's skilled hands fold batter like it was the simplest thing in the world. Faith, can you pass me the vanilla? Without pausing her task, Erna pointed to a small brown bottle, perched on a shelf, just out of reach. Here you go. Faith handed her the bottle, taking a moment to inhale the sweet scent that wafted from it. Nothing says party, quite like your vanilla sponge. Sure does, Erna agreed, pouring the fragrant liquid into the mixture. And wait till they see the icing roses I'd planned. Your hands create magic, said Faith, genuine admiration lacing her words as she watched the batter smooth into a velvety blanket at the base of the greased pan. Speaking of creating, how's the rest of the preparations coming along? Erna asked, sliding the pan into the oven. Everything's just about perfect, Faith assured her, though her gaze darted around the room, double-checking every corner for any sign of disarray. You know, we should do this more often, gets the whole house lively. First, let's survive today's liveliness, Erna laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. Survive? We'll thrive, Faith countered with a wink. Especially with your cake as our secret weapon. The front door creaked open and Faith's eyes found Jane, the youngest of the girls from the foundling home who were coming to Texas, her face lit with anticipation. Jane. Come in, come in. Faith called out, her voice warm as a southern breeze. Thank you, Faith. Jane stepped over the threshold, her eyes flitting across the festive decorations, with wonder. Here, I've made something for you. Faith pulled the quilt from behind her back, colors vibrant against the duller backdrop of the room. Oh, Faith, it's beautiful. Jane's fingers traced the intricate patterns, a soft smile blooming on her lips. Every stitch was sewn with you in mind, said Faith, her own smile as wide as Jane's. As the evening unfolded, laughter and chatter filled the air like fireflies at dusk. Amy and Tim were tucked away in a corner, lost in their own world of whispers and giggles. Brenda and Seth swayed to a fiddle tune. Cassandra and Andrew shared stories by the hearth, their laughter mingling with the crackling logs. Deborah and Aaron clinked glasses in a toast. Erna emerged from the kitchen, Joel by her side, presenting the cake like a trophy, its icing roses catching the lamplight. Susan and David orchestrated a playful game of charades, drawing chuckles and cheers from the gathering. Quite the pair, those two, Kane remarked to Faith, his grin easy and infectious. Indeed, Faith replied, the corners of her eyes crinkling with amusement. Gail and Max huddled together, poring over a book of poetry, their murmurs as soft as the summer wind. Hannah and Amos sat on the porch swing. Imogene and Adam debated light-heartedly over the best way to plant tomatoes, their banter ripe with affection. And Jane, sweet Jane, was encircled by several young men, each vying for her attention with jokes and flattery. She listened with grace, her laughter genuine, yet her eyes occasionally wandered, searching for something more amidst the sea of faces. Seems your quilt has warmed more than just her shoulders, Kane teased, nodding toward Jane. Perhaps, Faith agreed, her gaze following Jane's. But it's the warmth of this house that truly embraces us all. The last of the guests trickled down the lantern-lit path, their laughter fading into the night. Faith eased onto the front porch swing, her muscles sighing in relief. Beside her, Kane let out a contented chuckle as the swing creaked under their weight. Quite the soiree we had tonight, he said, his eyes twinkling like stars in the dusk. It was, Faith replied, pulling a loose strand of red hair behind her ear. I've never seen the house this full of life. We need to have more parties. Kane stretched his legs out, his boots thudding softly against the wooden planks. We should make a tradition of it, he said. Once a year, perhaps? Faith suggested. Or once a month. It felt right. Kane's voice was warm and inviting. He turned to her, his smile as easy as the summer breeze. You know, I can't remember the last time this place felt like more than just walls and floors. Faith nodded, understanding more than he realized. She looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. It's not the space, but who fills it that makes a home. Exactly. Kane's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. And you're the heart of it, Faith. Even when you're sitting quietly in a corner, stitching your quilts. She blushed at the compliment, feeling an unexpected warmth rush through her. Thank you, Kane. That means more than you know. They rocked in silence for a moment, the world around them peaceful and still. Faith couldn't help but feel a closeness to Kane that had been missing for too long. It was as if the evening had woven them together, thread by thread, into the fabric of each other's lives. Tonight was special, she finally said, her voice soft. It was, Kane agreed, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Thanks to you, Faith. As the porch swing continued its lazy arc back and forth, Faith knew that whatever the future held, moments like these were the stitches that bound her to Kane, to home, to everything she held dear. Chapter 13. Faith found herself as she sat in church. Texas in August was not something she was certain she wanted to go through again. She sat beside Kane, whose presence always seemed to make the pew more comfortable. The wooden church buzzed softly with whispered greetings and the sound of families settling in for Sunday service. Kane, Faith whispered, her green eyes following a figure moving through the aisle like a misplaced shadow. Who's that woman? Kane, who had been straightening his cuffs, glanced up nonchalantly. His brown hair caught the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. "Oh, that's Eloise," he said, a hint of surprise coloring his tone as he watched her take a seat not too far from them. "Eloise?" Faith echoed, her brows knitting together in curiosity. "And why is she here, do you think?" Kane's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but then he shrugged, his charming smile never far from his face. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of genuine puzzlement. The organ sprang to life then, its melody enveloping the congregation as everyone rose to sing. Faith couldn't stop watching the woman throughout the entire service, wondering why she was there. The final chords of the closing hymn still echoed in Faith's ears as she stepped out of the church into the blazing Texas sun. She squinted against the light, her hand reaching up to shield her eyes. Before she could take a breath of that hot, dusty air, a figure detached itself from the throng of parishioners and moved toward her with determined steps. "Are you Faith?" The woman's voice was soft, but carried an edge that sliced through the after-church chatter. "I am," Faith replied, turning to face the newcomer, the mysterious Eloise. The woman held herself with a grace that seemed at odds with the rural surroundings, her dress finer than most. Kane never mentioned he'd married. Eloise's eyes were rimmed with red, yet they held a steely resolve. "My husband passed not long ago. I've come to continue where Kane and I left off." "Kane and I are married," Faith said simply, the words like stones in her mouth. She offered nothing more, unwilling to tangle with past ghosts. Eloise's lips tightened, and then she turned away, skirts flouncing angrily, as she disappeared into the crowd as quickly as she had emerged. Faith watched her go, a knot forming in her stomach. "Ready to walk home?" Kane asked with a smile, but nothing could quite ease the sudden tension in Faith's shoulders. "Of course," she answered, slipping her arm through his as they began their journey back to the house. They walked in silence for a spell, the only sounds their footsteps and the distant call of a meadowlark. "Kane," Faith finally said, "do you still love Eloise?" He halted so abruptly that Faith nearly stumbled. He turned to her, his brown eyes wide with disbelief. "Love her?" "Faith, how can you even think?" He shook his head. "I love you. No one else." Her heart fluttered at his words, but the seed of doubt planted by Eloise's appearance needed more than reassurance to wither. "I just needed to hear it from you," she murmured, looking down at the dusty path. "Then hear this," Kane said, tilting her chin up so she met his gaze. "You are the one I cherish, Faith. Now and always." She searched his face, finding only truth shining back at her. A smile crept onto her lips, and they continued their walk home. Faith and Kane stepped through the front door, their Sunday best now feeling more like a restraint than an adornment. Cook had outdone herself again, the aroma of roast chicken seasoned with garden herbs wafted from the dining room, mingling with the scent of freshly baked bread. It was a wonderful meal, yet the flavors fell flat on Faith's tongue as her mind churned over Eloise's unexpected appearance. "Delicious, isn't it?" Kane commented, mistaking her silence for savoring. "It is," Faith replied politely, though her appetite had all but vanished. After the meal, she excused herself to the sanctuary of her sewing room. The neatness of the space comforted her. Spools of thread in a neat line, fabric folded crisp and clean, needles glinting in the afternoon light. She reached for a quilt she'd been piecing together, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Kane hesitated at the doorway before stepping into Faith's realm of patterns and textures. "I thought we might take that drive you enjoy so much," he suggested, his voice hopeful. Faith didn't look up from her work. "Not today, Kane." I don't feel up to it. Faith. There was a gravity in his tone now, and she set her sewing aside, finally meeting his gaze. Sit, please, she said, gesturing to the chair beside her. He complied, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. About Eloise, he said. She came into my life like a whirlwind, eager and vivacious. I was taken by her. At first. Faith listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I wanted to give her the world, Kane continued, and for a time, I tried. Jewelry, dresses, parties, I showered her with it all. But mother saw right through her. She warned me, said Eloise had eyes only for the wealth. I refused to believe it until. His voice trailed off, and he looked up, catching Faith's attentive green gaze. Until what? She prompted gently. Until one evening, Kane swallowed hard, she laughed and said she couldn't wait for my parents to pass on so that all this, he gestured absently around him, would be ours. Just like that, as if she were talking about the weather. Kane. Faith's voice was a whisper, laced with both sympathy and shock. It was then I knew, Kane said firmly, Eloise didn't care for me, but for what I could offer her. I ended things the very next day. That ring she wears, it should have been returned, but I hadn't the heart to ask for it. Thank you for telling me, Kane, Faith said, reaching out to touch his hand with her own. Their connection was a tangible comfort, bridging the gap that doubt had started to carve between them. Faith, I want you to know, he began, but she silenced him with a soft squeeze of his hand. Let's leave the past where it belongs, she said with a small smile, her heart lighter than it had been since morning service. We have our own future to think about. You are the woman I want to spend my life with. Not her. This home, our life together, it's where I belong, with you. He took her hand, turning it over, to press a kiss to her palm. The simple, yet profound declaration settled around them, wrapping Faith in a warmth that rivaled the Texas heat outside. A surge of emotion welled up within her. Kane, she said, I love you too. Truly, I do. But Eloise being back. It worries me. He nodded, understanding, lighting his features. I know it does, and I'm sorry for any unease she's caused. But remember this, you are my wife, my partner. Nothing she does or says can change that. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, the weight of worry lifting with each word he spoke. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, her forehead resting against his. Thank you, Kane, she whispered, her voice steady now. I will try not to be so insecure. They embraced, Faith nestling her head against Kane's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It thrummed a promise, a future free of shadows like Eloise. Kane's warmth enveloped her, a strong contrast to the coolness of the sewing room. Happy? He murmured, his breath tickling her ear. Very, she replied, tilting her face up to his. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of sweet certainty and shared dreams. When they parted, they were both smiling, the kind of smiles that spoke of deep contentment and shared secrets. Epilogue. Faith waddled across the porch, her hand resting on the swell of her belly that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The Texas summer heat clung to her skin like a second dress, one she dearly wished she could shed. Kane, ever the gentleman, despite his teasing nature, rushed to her side with a glass of lemonade, beads of condensation trickling down the side. Thank you, she sighed, accepting the refreshment and feeling the coolness seep into her palms. She took a small sip, relishing the sweet tang as it danced on her tongue. Darling, if I didn't know any better, I'd say you're about ready to declare war on childbirth, Kane joked, a twinkle in his eye as he settled beside her on the swing. War? Oh no, I've already surrendered, Faith quipped back, setting the glass on the railing. I mean it, Kane, 15 is my limit. I can't possibly chase after another little rascal. Fair enough, he chuckled. But you must admit, our brood is something special. Special and numerous, she agreed, a soft smile playing on her lips. But after this one, she patted her belly gently, I'm taking all my dresses in and never letting them out again. Kane reached over, his hand warm atop hers. Whatever you want, sweetheart. Though I do think we make some pretty remarkable children together. Remarkable and exhausting, Faith countered. Yet, as she gazed into Kane's eye, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement at the thought of meeting their newest addition. Exhausting, maybe, Kane conceded, leaning in for a peck on her forehead. But worth every sleepless night. Agreed, she murmured, contentment washing over her. Together, they rocked back and forth, the creak of the swing a familiar melody in the stillness of the afternoon. Despite the challenges, there was nowhere else she'd rather be. The Texas summer heat was in full force on the day Faith's labor began. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she gripped the edge of the quilt she'd stitched together months ago, a mosaic of life's small triumphs and trials. Deep breaths, Faith, Erna coaxed, her tone light despite the tension that hung over the room like a storm cloud waiting to burst. You can do this. Easy for you to say, Faith managed to retort between breaths, flashing her twin a wry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Green orbs, usually vibrant with resolve, now shimmered with the intensity of the moment. Hortense wedged a cool cloth between Faith's neck and the pillow. You're doing just fine, dear. The contractions came like waves, each one a crescendo building upon the last, until the room itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of impending birth. Erna's hands, so skilled at kneading dough into submission, now offered a gentler touch, massaging Faith's shoulders with practiced ease. Think of it as baking bread, Erna quipped, her attempt at humor floating through the charged air. It takes patience and a bit of elbow grease, but the end result is always worth it. I know that's not how you felt when you were in labor. Why are you cheerful through mine? Faith asked, another contraction seizing her. Her grip tightened on the quilt, its patchwork blurring as tears welled in her eyes. You sure did get bigger with this one, Hortense said, her voice steady. And then, with a final push that gathered all of Faith's strength and determination into one defining moment, the room filled with the unmistakable sound of a newborn's cry, followed by another, and then a third. The groan that escaped Faith was not of pain, but of a profound and exhausted awe as she lay back against the pillows, spent. Triplets, Hortense announced, her astonishment mirrored in the faces of those present. 3 little girls, Erna echoed, wonder lacing her words as she swaddled the first of the trio, her hands deft and sure. Girls, Faith breathed out, the single word a revelation wrapped in a whirlwind of love and sudden, overwhelming joy. My heart. Her sentence trailed off unfinished, but no further words were necessary. In that room, where love had multiplied beyond measure, the simple truth of companionship and the unspoken vows of family spoke louder than any declaration. They're perfect, Faith murmured, cradling her daughters with tenderness. As she looked down at the tiny faces, a fresh surge of love washed over her, and despite everything, she couldn't help but feel the promise of a new beginning. Kane's boots echoed softly on the wooden floor as he approached the bedroom door, his heart racing with the anticipation of meeting his new child. The door swung open, and there they were, 3 tiny bundles cradled in Faith's arms. A trio of miracles that turned his broad smile into a burst of hearty laughter. 17, he exclaimed, the joy in his voice filling the room. 17 children to call our own. His eyes sparkled with merriment, the laughter lines around them deepening as he looked upon his wife and daughters. 17, Faith repeated, her green eyes flickering with a mix of love and mischief. She gazed at Kane, then at the sleeping infants nestled against her. But no more, all right? This house is quite full enough. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, bending down to plant a gentle kiss on Faith's forehead. No more, he agreed, his voice a tender rumble. You've given us a beautiful family. Their eyes met, sharing an understanding that needed no words. Here, in this simple moment, surrounded by the warmth of their growing family, love was their truest companion. And it was more than enough.